Chapter 16 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. Chapter 16 Puzzling People. There was an air of expectancy about the Randolph household. They were in what Maria called a state of cleared-upness, and gathered in the back parlor at an unusually early hour in the afternoon. Tom had gone to the station to meet the newcomers, Faith and baby Halsted. He had gone rather against his will. In fact, this innovation was not of his appointing. "I don't want to go prowling through the depot in search of a strange girl with red hair and a baby," he growled, when the arrangement was being made. "She will be dowdy looking. Women with babies always are. And I shall be expected to carry the baby, and it will have a stick of candy in one hand and a hunk of gingerbread in the other." "All of which will be much more respectable than a great many positions in which you must have found yourself of late," Ermina observed, serenely. "At any rate, you will have to go. We can't expect father to do it, and as we have a brother, it is supposed to be his place to be courteous to company." "Especially the boarders," chimed in Maria. "Don't let us lose sight of the fact that this company is going to pay a wholesome price for her board every week of her life." "You would have been considerably wiser if you had allowed her to set her own price for board. She is worth 500,000, to speak within bounds. Horace is acquainted with their business lawyer, and we met him in New York. He says this girl has as much as that in her own right, and that she is Auntie Faye's heir. Besides, she would have paid you a splendid price for her board, for they have the name of being liberal people." This bit of advice and information came from Mrs. Horace Munroe, who was at home spending the day, overlooking the arrangements for receiving the newcomers, and giving advice freely on all subjects. Ermina's lip curled visibly, and Maria, as usual, spoke her thoughts. "We haven't reached as low a notch as that, Helen, if we are poor. She asked us to name our price, just as any lady of delicacy of feeling would have done, and we did it. A good fair price it is, too, more than she would have to pay in hundreds of places where she could have gone. But it no more than pays us for the extra expense and trouble it will be to us, and I for one wouldn't have taken a cent more than that. When I take to begging for a living, it shall be out and out begging. I won't whine around any one and say, 'You are rich and we are poor, and you are our 23rd cousin, you know, so please give us 5 times the worth of your living for sweet charity's sake, and call it board, you know.'" Mrs. Munroe laughed. "You are ridiculously fastidious in your notions, child," she said, with infinite patronage in her voice. "But you will recover from some of your follies by the time you have rubbed through with as much life as I have. Take what you can get, and have as nice a time as you can in this world, is my motto." She spoke serenely, much more serenely than Helen Randolph was given to doing. She looked well, too. Black silk dresses and real lace ruffles were undoubtedly becoming to Helen Munroe. She seemed made to adorn them. "One would never imagine that she had turned her dresses upside down and wrong side out, and darned 40 holes under the ruffles." This was Ermina's comment on the serene, faultlessly dressed lady; and this just expressed it. She looked like one born to the position which she was now filling, so easily and gracefully had she slipped into the real things, at least so far as lace and silk and velvet were concerned. Many were the surmises concerning the appearance of the coming lady. "I think she is tall and thin and pale," Grace said. "Don't you believe she is, Ermina?" "I don't believe anything about it. She was perhaps 3 years old when I saw her, or 4, didn't she say? And I must have been very little more than that. It is a poor age for determining whether one is 'tall and thin and pale.' She was a pretty little thing, wasn't she, Helen?" "Not particularly pretty, but she contrived to make every one imagine that she was. I never quite liked her. Everybody humored her so continually that it gave me a sense of never having my own way." "That must certainly have been trying to your disposition," Maria said merrily. "I can't conceive of there having been a time when you didn't try pretty hard for your way." "Maria," said Mrs. Munroe, as she finished off one of the little crimson wheels that she was crocheting, and laid it against the black ground of her dress to try the effect, "I hope, for your sake, that she won't be sharp. Two sharp people in one family would be very rasping to the nerves, and, as I remember her, I should say that it was the most likely thing in the world that she is sharp. I'm glad I don't live here." This last with a complacent glance at the house nearly across the street, with its lace curtains at the windows, and its body Brussels carpeting that her mind's eye beheld. Mrs. Munroe had always looked with longing eyes upon body Brussels carpets. Now she trod on them with satisfied feet every day of her life. Further comment was interrupted by the roll of carriage wheels, and the exclamation from Grace, "There they come!" "In one of Smith's hacks," said Mrs. Horace Munroe. "That's just like Tom, when he knows Stuarts are ever so much nicer." "Why, she isn't larger than a minute," Ermina said, peering from the window at the small creature who sprang briskly from the carriage, after giving a parcel carefully into Tom's hands. "Tom has the baby!" exclaimed Grace, in a tone of intense satisfaction. "He declared he would not touch him." "What else could he do with him?" Maria said composedly. "Why don't they bring him in, and not stand bothering over the baggage?" "Stand back from the window, Maria," Mrs. Munroe said, authoritatively. "It is in wretched taste to stare at people. Grace, do sit down. Ermina, aren't you going to the door to meet her? You forget that you are Miss Randolph now." "On the contrary," said Ermina, coolly, "I have a realizing sense of it. You are the only one who seems disposed to ignore that important fact. Please to remember that we do not live in a stone house, with lace curtains and lambrequins, so we have a right to stare just as much as we please. No, I'm not going to the door, as if we were slaves and she our queen. Tom knows the way in." Apparently he did, for at this point the door swung open and Tom set a bundle down in the middle of the room. Said bundle shook itself and revealed inside of its white cloak a small, fair, blue-eyed baby, who looked around the room with a delighted smile, clapped a pair of small, fat hands, and said emphatically, "Ta-tare!" "Oh, the little darling!" said Grace, rushing toward him, and the rest were welcoming his sister, Faith. "Which is which?" she said, looking earnestly from one to the other. "Oh, you are Maria! Now aren't you? There, what a triumph! I told Auntie Faye I remembered your eyes. Now I have proved it. And this is Helen, or no, Mrs. Munroe. You live nearly across the way, Tom says. Isn't that splendid? Baby and I can call on you every morning. Oh, isn't my baby a darling?" Altogether, Mrs. Munroe's dignified reception, in which she was to prove to this young heiress that she, at least, was equal in position and culture to herself, seemed not to fit the present occasion. One might as well have to be ceremonious with a robin. Some way they all forgot dignity and propriety, and were in full tide of eager talk when Tom came from the trunks and the hack driver. "Isn't she a case?" he said to Maria, following her to the kitchen for a confidential chat. "I don't know whether she is as harmless as a dove, or as wise as a serpent, or both, or neither. I know I never met such a creature since I was born. Why, Maria, she knows more about our neighbors than you do. She asked all manner of questions concerning them, and was as interested in the number of children each of them owned as if she meant to start a select school in this neighborhood to-morrow, and live on it the rest of her days." "Indigestible living," said Maria. "Tom, won't you get me a pail of water? She might not think it aristocratic in me to go myself, and she stands looking out of the window. I see her." They had a very merry tea. Mr. Randolph came home early, dreading the presence of a stranger, eager to have the meeting over and to get back to the office. The newcomer stood at the window as the gate clicked. "Is that he?" she asked eagerly. "Is that Uncle Randolph? Who is that other gentleman, a young one?" "That is my husband," Helen answered with conscious pride. Mr. Munroe was a handsome young man. She expected him to make an impression. "Oh," Faith said, Then it's all in the family. We'll go and meet them. Where's my baby?" And catching him from Grace's arms, she perched him on her shoulder, and ran gaily out to the hall. They heard her clear, ringing voice. "We're coming to meet you, Uncle Randolph, baby and I. We are going to call you Uncle Randolph, both of us, because we have no uncle of our own, and we've always wanted one. Kiss the new uncle, Pearlie. You don't mind being our uncle, do you, sir?" Baby touched his cool, pink tongue to Mr. Randolph's sallow cheek, and immediately thereafter seized upon his gold-bowed glasses by way of recompense. "Yes, I mind it," said Mr. Randolph, heartily. "I shall be most thankful to have a niece and nephew. You don't remember my wife, I suppose?" And his voice faltered. "You are just her size." "I remember her distinctly," Faith said, earnestly. "Not her face, you know, but her kisses. I was homesick, and she kissed me like mamma. I never forgot them." Mr. Randolph bent over and kissed her on cheek and lip, leaving the touch of a tear on her face. He was not given to caresses, was not a demonstrative man. But he, too, remembered tender clinging kisses that he used to have, and received no more. Faith Halsted's place in his heart was secured. Mr. Munroe had meantime been divesting himself of his duster and making silent advances toward friendship with the bright-eyed baby. He turned to Faith now. "I am not to be left out in the cold, I trust," he said, with a winning smile. "I think, according to the compact which has just been formed, I must be a cousin." "Oh, yes," said Faith, heartily. "You are Helen's husband. She told me so. She said it as if she thought you were very nice. And as for baby and me, we are glad of all the relations we can get. We have been alone a long time. Do you like baby kisses? Pearlie, have you a kiss for Cousin Horace?" But Pearlie was seized with one of those obstinate fits peculiar to babydom, and would neither kiss nor shake hands nor make a bow. In fact, he ignored the gentleman completely, and tugged mercilessly at Mr. Randolph's whiskers. But the introductions, which Mrs. Munroe had planned to conduct with due ceremony, were over, and the whole company went gaily out at Maria's call to the table. In the little sitting-room that same evening, Faith made the acquaintance of Peter Armstrong. The early spring evenings were cool for baby natures, and at sunset a fire was built in the cozy back sitting-room, which, with the large room adjoining, had been given up to Faith. Tom's business calling him elsewhere, Peter volunteered to be fire-builder, and was bent down in front of the stove when Faith's clear voice addressed him. "You are Peter Armstrong, I think, and I am Faith Halsted. Shall we shake hands on it?" Peter stood up suddenly in great surprise. A small white hand, on which a single diamond gleamed, was held out to meet his red, rough one. This was an utterly new experience to him. Nevertheless, he held his red hand out for her to do with it what she would, and she clasped it cordially. Pearlie sat in the middle of the floor, gravely watching the operation, and at this point he laughed, showing a half-dozen dainty pearls, and clapped his small fat hands. "Baby approves of our acquaintance," said Faith. "You must consider that a compliment. He doesn't like everybody." Peter smiled broadly, and snapped a clumsy thumb and forefinger at Baby, whereupon that small being went into a perfect ecstasy of laughs and crows and spatting of hands. Baby believed in Peter. Faith's next sentence was as unexpected and quite as bewildering to her new acquaintance as the hand-shaking had been. "I'm much interested in your method of reading the Bible," she said simply. Peter stared. "My method?" he repeated in a dazed sort of a way. He hadn't the least idea that there was such a thing as method about his reading. "Yes, Tom told me. I like it ever so much. If my name had been Mary or Sarah, I should have done the same. How did you happen to think of it?" Now, Tom's information had been given in this wise. Finding his companion interested in every man, woman, child, and even animal that they saw during their ride from the depot, he had said, among other things, as he chanced to see Peter crossing the street, "There's Peter Bible." And she responded, "Peter Bible? What a very queer name!" "He's a queer fellow," Tom had said. That name is one of my coining, part of it at least. His name is Peter, but the Bible part grew out of the fact that he has lately taken to hunting up the old fellow who figured in those days, and comparing notes with him." Then Faith had asked numberless questions concerning Peter Armstrong, and secured his history, so far as Tom could give it. So now she said, "How did you happen to think of it?" "Tom told me about him," Peter said simply. "I don't know much about the Bible, ma'am. I'm reading it over for the first time. But he mentioned to me that there was a Peter in the Bible, and I naturally wanted to know about him." "Well, how do you like him?" Faith asked, as she rescued a match and a pair of scissors from Pearlie's grasp. "I'm disappointed in him," Peter said, gravely, the sad, perplexed look which she had first noticed sweeping over his face as he bent down again to the fire. Faith tried to suppress a laugh. One of her propensities was to laugh at inconvenient times, but it certainly did seem funny to hear this rough-faced, roughly clothed boy express his disappointment in St. Peter with his 1800 years of glory about him. "What has he been doing?" she asked, when she could command her voice. Peter sighed heavily. "He's so queer," he said, gravely. "He does things when you least expect him to. Now, night before last I was reading about the wonderful things that Jesus said to him, how he called him blessed, and said, 'Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church.' And I thought how happy Peter must have been, and it seemed to me he could never do anything wrong again, and last night, only a few verses after that, I came upon this one. Then Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, 'Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee.' And he was speaking to Jesus himself. Only think of that now. Began to rebuke him. That does beat all I ever heard of. I don't know who could help being disappointed in him." The laugh was gone from Faith's face. In its place was sadness. "I know," she said musingly. "How like ourselves it is." "Ma'am," said Peter, in wondering amazement, "do you think it is the way folks would do now? I can't think it. I know I wouldn't speak that way to the Lord himself." Faith smiled. "I am thinking of one part of the words and you of another," she said. "I was thinking of, 'This shall not be unto thee.' How often we say it in spirit. I have done it myself, and gone away and forgotten it." "I don't understand," said Peter, humbly. "Why, have you never promised the Lord, 'This shall not be'? Thou shalt not have it to bear. I will not bring this reproach upon thy name again. I will not grieve thy spirit any more. And before the day and perhaps the hour was past, have done that thing, or worse than that, again and again." Peter laid down the armful of kindlings he had been gathering up preparatory to departing, and, rising to his feet, stood looking at Faith with earnest, searching eyes. "I see," he said at last. "Why, yes, I understand you, but I never thought of it, never. But Peter didn't mean that way, though. It wasn't respectful in him." "I know it. I am not excusing Peter. I think he repented bitterly, but I was thinking of myself as being led through different steps into a like boastfulness of faith and devotion." "I see," Peter said again. "There's two ways of reading that story. One way is to find fault with Peter, who is in heaven and out of all the fuss and trouble forever, and another way is to measure my own heart by it, and see whether it will stand looking into. I understand about the faults of Peter, ma'am, but I never thought anything about the other part until this minute, and I am truly obliged to you." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Opposing Elements. "It is the merest act of commonplace courtesy," Mrs. Munroe said, and she spoke authoritatively. She stood in the kitchen doorway. Time, a warm spring day among the closing ones of May. It was 11 o'clock, and Maria was in full tide of preparation for the noonday dinner, her sleeves tucked above her elbows, a large calico apron covering her neat calico dress, and she pared potatoes with an energy that betokened a perturbed state of mind. Her cheeks were red too, but that might have been from the fire, for the kitchen was insufferably hot. Mrs. Munroe lifted her straw hat from her shapely head and fanned herself leisurely while she talked. Her dinner hour was 1, and the dinner itself was in the hands of Becky, a pattern cook who had lived in some of the Munroe families since babyhood. So Mrs. Munroe, in her blue and white plaid wrapper, with linen cuffs and small standing collar, fastened with a spray of lava which was one of her husband's gifts, looked the picture of refinement and leisure. She continued her sentence, unmindful of the glow on Maria's cheeks. "I don't see how you can avoid it. Everybody does such things." "But I tell you, Helen, we have got to avoid it. We haven't the money to waste in any such senseless way." "Senseless? You are very sweeping in your condemnations. If you live in the world, you must act like other people a little, even if you do feel yourself superior to them. And that has always been your trouble, having too high an estimate of yourself. As to money, that is nonsense. How much will it cost, I wonder, to have half a dozen friends to take tea with you? You needn't make a great flourish. In fact, it would be in bad taste for persons in your circumstances to do so. But a few intimate friends. I'm sure I don't see how you are to avoid it, unless you girls mean to decline all invitations for yourselves. While poor mother was living, she was so much of an invalid that people didn't expect to be invited here, and of course they didn't expect it while we were in mourning. But now it is different." Maria splashed the potatoes about in the rinsing water with such energy as to give her apron a shower bath, and spoke with unusual sharpness. "I wonder, Helen, if getting married has destroyed all the common sense you ever possessed. You know that mother was never so much of an invalid but that she would have enjoyed company if we had been able to afford it, but we weren't, and we aren't now." "Well, don't talk so loud. How you do fly into a passion over every trifle! That is a very unladylike trait. You ought to break yourself of it before you are older. I wonder how you came to be so mercenary, Maria. I'm sure there are things of importance as well as money. You talk as if that was the only thing worth any consideration." "I have to consider how to get along without it so constantly that it is no wonder it is often in my thoughts." Something had calmed Maria. She spoke more in her usual tone of cool indifference. "I know," said Mrs. Munroe, thoughtfully. "You have had a hard time of it, and I think you have managed very well, considering your age. But I should think things must be very much better with you now. Tom receiving a salary, and Ermina working in that horrid shop. But they give her very fair wages. And Faith pays a good price for her board. There's considerable coming in." "And considerable going out," said Maria, as she landed the wireful of potatoes into the bubbling kettle. "There are old bills to pay, and Ermina has undertaken to help pay them. Father's quarter's salary won't begin to do it. And we are out of everything under the sun, from flour to brooms, to say nothing of clothes. There are ways enough for the money, I can assure you." "But for all that," said Mrs. Munroe, going back persistently to her first idea, as such natures do, "I think you ought to give a little company. Of course I don't speak for myself, although it is common for brides to be invited to their former homes for entertainment, and I presume Horace's folks think it strange that we are not. But I could get along without it. Only there is Faith, coming here a stranger, our cousin, and it is so singular not to pay her any attention. Besides, you girls owe it to yourselves. What society will you have if you ignore its claims upon you as we have been doing?" "The claims of society are a humbug," said Maria, basting her roast beef until its savory odor filled the kitchen. "I always thought so. Here we, as poor as mice, poorer for that matter, must twist and turn and scrimp and make pound cake and other stuff, and invite a company to jam into our dining room and make fun of our nicked dishes and our tin coffee pot, so that they will invite us to similar shams if they are poor, or show us how unutterably shoddy our efforts are if they are rich. That's society." "Oh, well," said Mrs. Munroe, fanning herself with more energy, You can't have the millennium come right away, even if you want it. And I get along very well with the world as it is. It is nonsense in you to talk about a jam. Your dining room is large, I'm sure, and it's very respectably furnished, and a few friends to tea would be very pleasant. You could have spoons and napkins and such things from my house, and Becky to help you. She would show you just how to do everything. And as to the silver, why, you could have my coffee urn and cake baskets." "I should never do it in the world," sputtered Maria. "If we are foolish enough, in our circumstances, to give a tea party, I would insist upon its being according to our circumstances, and not yours. I'll serve no coffee from borrowed urns, you may be sure of that. Spoons and napkins are bad enough, but they are common necessities." "That's pride," said Mrs. Munroe complacently. It was not this conversation, nor a dozen others alike, held when the combined forces were gathered, for both Ermina and Grace took earnest sides with Maria, that finally settled the question of company. It was Mr. Randolph returning, after he had started for the office, to say, in hesitating tones, to Maria, who occupied the dining room alone, "Could you manage a little company to tea, Maria? Helen and Horace, and a few of their friends. Helen feels as if her new family relations ought to be recognized, I presume. Could you bring it about, daughter?" "Why, yes, sir," Maria said, speaking slowly and hesitatingly, with a glow on each cheek. Helen married was worse than Helen at home among them. "We can, if you think best, but we don't consider it at all necessary. And, father, having company is rather expensive business." Mr. Randolph winced, as he always did when finance was the subject of conversation. Poor man, there was nothing he would have liked better than a fortune, unless, indeed, it were to be at rest somewhere, where money was never mentioned. Mr. Randolph's tastes, like his daughter Helen's, were royal. "Never mind," he said hurriedly. "A few shillings more or less cannot make much difference in the end. I would not try to do much. Something very simple and within our means. People know we are poor. They must take the will for the deed. I do not like to hurt Helen's feelings by passing her new connection over entirely. You will manage it right, daughter. You always do." And then Mr. Randolph went away, leaving Maria the picture of dismay. She had not meant to yield this point. She knew they were in the habit of making company for a married daughter, but she was personally very indifferent to them, and she had reckoned on battling the matter out with Helen. She had not counted on the half-dozen words that Mrs. Munroe let drop sadly in her father's hearing. "If mother were here, Horace, your mother and father would be cordially welcomed to this house. We miss mother in everything." So the cake-making and the discussions commenced again. Maria, having yielded against her will, did it with a very ill grace, and made herself extra trouble, as angry people are apt to do. 3 several afternoons did Becky present herself, her hair done in the neatest little knot imaginable, her apron large and clean, and announced herself ready to make cake or do anything that Miss Maria wanted of her. Miss Maria wanted nothing. Not an egg would she let Becky beat, not a raisin was she allowed to touch. Mrs. Munroe came over and stood in the kitchen door, in cool, summery toilet, and fanned herself, while she told Maria that she was certainly very silly. Becky knew how to do everything much better than she did, and that she, Mrs. Munroe, had put herself out in order to let Becky help over here. "Put yourself in again," said ungrateful Maria, "as soon as you choose. We have lived thus far without any of Becky's assistance, and we shall continue for a little while." "But you are not accustomed to entertaining company," persisted the eldest sister, "and you are nothing but a young girl. Now, she knows how they arrange everything. She has assisted some of the very first families in town." "Did you ever hear of the man who told his transient boarder that if she couldn't stand in the eating line for 1 week, what he had to endure all his life, it was a pity? I might say the same to my guests. I'm sure I have done the cooking for you ever since I could talk, nearly, and you are still alive. I'll venture it 1 night longer." This was all the reply that the inexorable Maria had to make, and she burned her cheeks and her finger, and made all the cake herself. Delicious cake it was, too. She had that accomplishment, I think no one who has ever attempted to compound the depraved stuff will deny. There were other things about which she obstinately insisted on her own way. "How on earth came you to think of inviting Nettie Thatcher?" was Mrs. Munroe's exclamation on one of the aforesaid afternoons. "It wasn't a very hard thing to think of," Maria said composedly. "I've performed more severe mental labor than that many a time." "Don't for pity's sake try to be funny, Maria. It is too warm for that. But what possesses you to think you must mix people up so?" "I'm not mixing them up. It is entirely your work. If I could have had my own way, I should have left them all in peace and quietness to get their suppers at their usual hours, instead of coming here and waiting for it until bedtime. But since it had to be done, I thought Nettie might as well wait as the rest of you." "Well, I thought you had more sense than that. She never expects to be invited in our set. You certainly couldn't have thought that you would hurt her feelings by leaving her out, for no one invites her?" "Why don't they?" "Well, for several reasons. In the first place, she doesn't belong, as I said, to our set in society." "Why doesn't she?" "How do I know? I don't suppose she has a suitable thing to wear." "That's her concern, not mine. I don't have to clothe the people, only to feed them. For that matter, I've heard you make the same remark about yourself many a time, yet you didn't consider it a reason why people should ignore your acquaintance." Mrs. Munroe laughed complacently. It was a source of unceasing comfort to her that she would never be obliged to make that remark again. Then she turned to the charge. "What is the use of talking this nonsense? I insist that there is no sense in your thinking of inviting Nettie Thatcher. She is not in our circle of society, and we can't put her in." "She is a member of the same church with yourself, Helen." "Oh, well, now, that has nothing to do with the subject. People may talk about equality and all that sort of thing to the end of time, and there will still be classes, or grades, or sets, or whatever you please to call them." "But what shall make them, Helen? Education, or worth, or money? For instance, Nettie Thatcher is a good principled, noble-hearted girl, with a very fair education, as good as yours or mine, certainly, and she is refined and gentle in her manners. The entire difficulty lies in the fact that she works in a mill. Now, what common sense is there in that?" Mrs. Munroe sniffed energetically, and her reply was very much to the point. "You are burning that cake, Maria. I smell it. Scorched cake is horrid stuff. Becky never has the least bit of burn on hers. What a simpleton you are not to let her help you. Something horrid will happen, just because of your obstinacy. I expect to fairly die of mortification." "In that case, your troubles, so far as my cake is concerned, will certainly be over," Maria said composedly. "Well, at least I hope you won't insist on mortifying Nettie Thatcher with an invitation which she won't know what to do with. You can't make the world over, and it isn't worth while to try. Nettie seems well enough satisfied with her own sphere. Don't mix things." Maria closed the oven door with a bang. "It's of no sort of use to hold an argument with you," she said, hotly. "You would dance around in a bandbox all day, and never discover that the bottom was out. But you can compose your mind on one point. Nettie Thatcher has been invited, and has accepted the invitation." Mrs. Munroe's cheeks reddened angrily. "Then all I have to say is," and she said it in a somewhat high key, "I think you are a very headstrong, obstinate girl, and you take a great deal on yourself for one of your age. I am sure I don't see why Ermina don't control you better. I would rather not have any company than to have people who never saw each other before, and never will again, sit stiffly around trying to make talk, when they have nothing in common. I wonder what Mr. Harper will think of such a company. I guess he will wonder where you picked up Nettie Thatcher." "I will clear out a clothes press for the gentleman if you think he cannot breathe the same air that Nettie does for one evening," Maria said, now thoroughly exasperated; and her sister gathered herself up in wrath and went home, leaving the kitchen in outward peace for the rest of the day. There was one redeeming feature of Mrs. Munroe's character. She never stayed angry. The next morning's sun found her as peaceably disposed toward the family across the way, and as ready to aid them as ever. She came over just before the dinner hour. She had a new scheme, which she brought before Ermina, who was slicing cold meat for the hurried dinner, for it was the day of the coming entertainment. "Dinners are of no account in this house to-day," as she shaved the great pinky slices. "It is the supper toward which our stomachs are eagerly looking. This is simply to stay them till 7 o'clock." Mrs. Munroe, thus reminded of the tardiness of her plans, came to the point at once. "I wish we could have a little currant wine to serve with the cake this evening." Ermina, in her astonishment, forgot the matronly name, and exclaimed, "Why, Helen Randolph!" "Well, I do," said Mrs. Munroe firmly. "It is simple, and at the same time elegant. They have it at a great many little parties where other liquors are considered objectionable. And your cake is so ridiculously plain, you need something to set it off. You humor Maria so in all her whims, I wonder at you." Ermina laughed. "It is she who humors me in mine, when she occasionally allows me to have my own way," she said, good-humoredly. "But I consider it no more than fair that the one who does all the work should do some of the managing. As to currant wine, you might as well propose a glass of prussic acid all around. You seem to have forgotten father's opinions?" "Oh, father? I could coax him over to my side in less than 5 minutes. I really think you ought to have something of the kind, and that is so simple that the most morbid temperance people use it. City people don't look at these things as we do, anyway — in large cities, I mean. Mr. Harper, now, is a temperance man, quite an earnest one, I've heard, and I've no doubt that he would think father's ideas ridiculously narrow and straight-laced. We have some splendid currant wine that Horace's mother made 2 years ago. It was Horace's idea to offer it here this evening. He thinks it will make things more free and easy. If it were not for Maria, we might bring it over quietly, and serve it without saying anything to father. But I suppose she would make an outrageous fuss." "If it were not for Maria and Ermina and all the rest of us, you would better say. That will never be done in this house, I assure you. You are welcome to get father's consent if you can, though I think he has trouble enough without bothering his brains about such things. But everything that has to do with him shall be fair and square. No slipping in and doing things quietly. I won't consent to it." "No one thought of asking you to. You are as bad as Maria. I'm not afraid but that I would get father's consent to it in 2 minutes." "Very well," said Ermina, composedly. "Try it, and I wish you joy in the undertaking. He is coming. You will have an opportunity to vanquish him before dinner, if it is only to take 2 minutes." Chapter 18 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. Chapter 18. The Force of Argument. "Father," said Mrs. Munroe, turning to meet the weary, sallow-faced man, "you don't look as well as usual to-day. Are you feeling badly?" "No worse than usual, Helen," he said, trying to smile cheerily. "I haven't much to boast of in the way of strength." "I think you need a tonic of some kind. Horace's father has been real miserable for several days, and Dr. Marvin ordered wine bitters for him. He thinks they are helping him. I wish you would try currant wine, father. That is harmless enough, and it is real strengthening. I'm going to bring some over to-night for the company, and I want you to try it. Will you?" From the time of her earliest recollection her father had worn to Helen Munroe the same kind, patient, tender face; easily moved, easily coaxed, apparently; one of those men whom natures like Ermina's and Maria's shrank from wounding or jarring in any way; hence his wish had grown into being their law; one of those men whom natures like Helen's wheedled into doing dozens of things which he did not want to do, to which his higher nature objected, simply because he shrank morbidly from argument, from strife, from scenes of any sort. Very rarely had Mrs. Munroe seen him either excited or determined. She did not understand her father. He turned toward her now, a bright red spot burning on the sallow cheek, and his voice was slow and low. "Helen, it is very seldom that I assert my decided views in regard to things. It is very seldom, indeed, that I issue any commands. But I thought my children understood my position in this matter. There can no currant wine ever be served in my house to guests of mine. Don't forget it." Then he turned and went with quick, trembling steps out of the room. "There!" said Ermina, angrily. "I hope you will enjoy your dinner. You have spoiled father's. Do go home." And Mrs. Munroe immediately went. "You will have to give up your currant wine plans," she said to her husband when they met at their late dinner. "Father is really fierce about it. He actually frightened me." Then she told him her attempt and its result. Mr. Horace Munroe laughed. That thin, pale old man, old before his time, with not business capacity enough to have risen even yet above clerkship, with not mental power enough to care to converse for half an hour with anybody, the idea of being cowed by him, or of not doing as one liked in spite of him! He did not say all this to his wife. He did not say a word of it. He was learning Mrs. Munroe's nature. There were things that it would not bear. She could get thoroughly exasperated with her sisters, she could feel at times utter contempt for her brother Tom, she could even lose patience with her father, but woe to the foolish being who dared to sympathize with these feelings. To be out of sorts with her own flesh and blood was one thing. To allow anyone else to do so was utterly another. Mr. Munroe was wiser, therefore he kept all his thoughts to himself, and laughed and said, "Well, their loss is our gain. Never mind," and then dismissed the subject. Very early in the evening Mrs. Munroe crossed again to her father's house, ready dressed for the reception which she had gotten up for herself. She was dressed in the much talked-over lavender silk, with its elaborate trimmings and elegant laces. She felt called upon to apologize to Ermina's stare of astonishment. "You know I am a bride, Ermina, and they always expect brides to dress a good deal the first few times they go out in company." "I'm glad there's no prospect of my being a bride," Ermina said, coldly. "They seem to expect them to be guilty of all sorts of absurd and preposterous things. What are you going to wear to parties, Helen?" "I really don't believe you ever will be one, Ermina. You are altogether too blunt and sharp." The question she ignored. Ermina laughed. "Both blunt and sharp. I should think I might be about right then, as they are both extremes. But I don't know that you are any sillier than I am. I expect to swelter in this gray dress, but I must wear it, because it cost $1 a yard, and my comfortable one was only 20 cents. We are all fools together. That's the conclusion that Peter Armstrong has arrived at, and I agree with him." This suggested a new trouble to Mrs. Munroe. "What have you done with Peter?" she asked, anxiously. "Done with him? Ironed his best shirt to the last degree of smoothness, and cut the fringes off his cuffs, and made a new bow to his necktie. He is in very good order for the occasion, I assure you." Mrs. Munroe stood aghast. "He isn't going to be here with the company? Now is he?" "Why, of course he is. Isn't he one of the boarders, and hasn't he as good a right to his supper as any of us?" Mrs. Munroe sat down in the nearest chair in speechless indignation. "I never saw such works," she managed to say at last. "You are quite as wild as Maria. Why, I used to think that you had common sense. The idea of Peter Armstrong being at a tea-party! He never knows what to do with his feet nor his hands." "His feet are all right this time. He has made them shine beautifully. And as for his hands, no doubt he will make them useful. He generally does. Don't fret about things, Helen. I'm Miss Randolph, you know. Your responsibility in this family has ceased." "That is very evident," Mrs. Munroe said, tartly. Then both ladies went in search of Maria. They found her in the dining room, busy over the table, which was fragrant with flowers and leaves. "This table really looks very pretty," Mrs. Munroe said. "Who arranged it? It must be Grace's work. She has the most tasteful hands of any of you. Why, Maria Randolph!" "At your service, ma'am. What can I do for you?" "I should think it was quite time you were dressed for the evening." "Dressed! Hear the woman! And I've been prinking for the last hour." "And arrayed yourself in a calico dress at last!" "English cambric, ma'am. Cost 25 cents a yard, and cheap as dirt at that. I have the clerk's word for it." "Maria, what is the use of being so disagreeable? I'm sure I don't like to do things to mortify you. Why should you care to treat me so?" Maria turned toward her in genuine astonishment. "I hadn't such an idea, Helen," she said earnestly. "I didn't think it would make any difference to you what I wore. In fact, I didn't think about you at all, and I had several reasons for choosing this dress. In the first place, my poplin is insufferably hot. Warm doesn't express it. And besides, it's too long for table serving. Then I remembered what you said about mortifying Nellie Thatcher, and I determined that I wouldn't mortify her by appearing better dressed than she might be." "You are very considerate," Mrs. Munroe said, coldly, turning away as she spoke. But she said no more against the pretty cambric dress. The guests began to assemble, few in number, and, for the most part, a choice selection. Mrs. Horace Munroe was conspicuous in her lavender silk, even her mother-in-law wearing a plain black one. But she drew consolation from the thought that she was a bride, and was expected to be conspicuous. Not the least interesting among the young faces was that of Nettie Thatcher. Her dress, too, was certainly unobjectionable. It was one of those soft, still grays, of a material so vague that even Mrs. Munroe's practiced eye failed to determine to what class it belonged, nor how much it might possibly have cost a yard. Her ornaments were rare and exquisite enough. They were small, blue, wildwood flowers. Mrs. Munroe, standing near her, moved dexterously forward as Mr. Harper entered, and her voluminous skirts and ruffles and puffs served to hide the quiet little wildwood flower behind her. "There is no necessity for performing conspicuous and disagreeable introductions," she said, in undertone, to Grace, who sought her shelter. "He will not know there is any one behind me. He is fastidious in his tastes, and extremely inconvenient in his questionings." He came very soon to her corner, and greeted her with a cordial shake of the hand, and almost his second sentence was, "Whom are you hiding behind you, Mrs. Munroe?" Then, as his eye caught a view of her, "Ah, Miss Nettie!" he said, and there was unmistakable pleasure in his voice. Immediately he held out his hand to her, and Mrs. Munroe had the pleasure of hearing their conversation. "I haven't seen you in an age, Nettie." "Not since Saturday evening." Mr. Harper laughed. "Was it so recent as that? Well, it seems longer. How are matters progressing?" "Very smoothly, so far as I can learn." "How does it happen that you have been beguiled out of your retirement?" "It doesn't take much to beguile me when people give me a chance to come." Her laugh was low and sweet. "Who gave you the chance? Was it Miss Randolph's invitation?" "No, Maria's." "Oh, I don't think I know her." "Don't you? Come with me, then, and we'll find her." And immediately the soft gray dress was shaken out, and Nettie Thatcher crossed the room with the only very distinguished guest they had. This Mr. Harper, about whom so much has been hinted, deserves a more extended mention. He was not a resident of the little city where the Randolphs lived. In fact, he was the junior partner of one of those mammoth firms in New York. He had charge of the foreign branch establishment and lived abroad. He was spending a year at home, that is, in this country, sending out one of the confidential clerks of the firm to take his place, while he attended to various outside business matters. And ever and anon he came back to the old homestead, situated in this little city, spending days and sometimes weeks with an old aunt, the sole remaining branch of the old family tree, and the only mother he had ever known. Great was the estimation in which he was held in the city. Thus much about him. What sort of a man was hidden behind all this external of wealth and importance you may discover for yourselves as chance makes you acquainted with him. Later in the evening he stood beside Ermina. "You are looking weary," he said, bending a little and speaking in a low tone. "Am I?" she said gravely. "It is an unpardonable offense. As hostess I ought to look as fresh as a June morning, no matter if I have been on my feet since daylight. But I can't. Even my looks refuse to be hypocritical." "Have you schooled them not to be?" he asked earnestly. "Not I. They schooled themselves. Hypocrisy was left out of my nature. I can plead guilty to every other sin in the calendar, but I haven't enough of that to get on comfortably in this flattery-loving world." "What a pity!" He said it quietly and apparently in perfect sincerity. Something prompted her to answer him with equal gravity. "What do you mean? What is a pity?" "Do you know Burns? And are you acquainted with that honest bit of life he wrote, commencing, 'O wad some power the giftie gie us'? I was thinking what a pity it is that he was right, that people know so little about themselves." "Do you mean me to make a personal application of that remark?" "I hoped you would," he said with a bright smile. "Then I should think you meant that I was hypocritical without knowing it." "If I mean just that, what then?" "Well," said Ermina, in undisguised astonishment, "I certainly don't think you are one. I'm sufficiently interested in myself, however, to make my acquaintance. So if you really mean just that, will you tell me how?" "I beg your pardon," he said gently. "I think I am presuming a great deal on a first acquaintance. But I have imagined you to belong in a measure to that class of persons who veil their better selves, who hide their tender and gentle and sympathetic feelings under a mask of coldness or brusqueness." "People are educated into doing that," she answered quickly, "because there is so much sham tenderness and mock sympathy." "Because there is counterfeit money in circulation, Miss Randolph, you and I must counterfeit some for ourselves. Is that it?" Ermina laughed a little. "I believe I am a poor logician," she said. "But, Mr. Harper, don't you think hypocrisy is the besetting sin of polite society?" "One of them, and the want of it is the besetting sin of some people?" "What can you mean? It is certainly not one of the Christian virtues in any case." "I'm not so sure of that. There is a kindness of spirit, a gentleness of manner, a willingness to yield to the feelings of others, that by many would be termed hypocrisy, that to me is one of the Christian graces. I have seen just such lovely characters, and have heard their owners denounced as hypocrites simply because they did not speak all that they might think. What do you imagine Paul meant by becoming all things to all men?" "I don't remember ever having given it a thought." "Haven't you? It seems to me that he desired to cultivate that grace of sympathizing with other people's views and feelings, and even whims, so far as it was possible." "But don't you think there is danger of carrying the theory too far?" "Not if we adopt the other part of Paul's doctrine, that I might by all means save some. The Christian who takes that as his motto, works for that, prays for it, will not be likely to get far astray in regard to it." "How many people live according to that standard, do you imagine?" "Let us hope that many do. Let us be sure that you and I do." "I am sure that I do not," she said emphatically. "But you wish to?" "No, I cannot even be said to wish to, since I have never thought of the subject in that light before." "You are a Christian, I think?" "Why, I'm not even sure of that. At least, not in this hypocritical sense. I am a member of the church, if that is what you mean." "No, I do not mean that," he said quickly. "In one sense it matters very little what I profess if I do not possess." "Your talk of St. Paul reminds me of St. Peter," she said, with a sudden change of tone. "We have him here to-night. That is he leaning against the side window. He don't know what to do with his hands nor his feet, nor the rest of his body, for that matter. I think I ought to go over and talk to him. Not to carry out your theory, however, for I would rather have a talk with him than with 2/3 of our guests." "Who is he?" asked Mr. Harper, very much amused. "He is our boarder," she answered him with sparkling eyes. "Hypocritically, we take him because it is convenient to have some one to do errands for us, and because we are sorry for the poor boy, and wanted to give him a pleasant home. But honestly, because Mr. Evans, for whom he works, pays a fair price for his board, and we needed the money." "Will you take me to see him? I have noticed his face, and there are reasons why I am interested in him." So the next thing Mr. Harper did was to cross the room to Peter Armstrong and shake hands with him. Maria's cake was certainly appreciated, the dainty little supper was thoroughly neat in all of its appointments, and Maria herself was feeling that if it were not for to-morrow, and the bills, and the folly of trying to be like well-to-do people when you were poor people, she would quite enjoy herself. As it was, she tried to lay aside all thoughts of the morrow for a little space, and was doing the honors of her end of the room, when a diversion occurred at the other end. Her brother-in-law, Mr. Munroe, came from the pantry with a tray and glasses, and the glasses were glowing with wine. Maria set the spoon-holder down with a jingle, and paused in the midst of her sentence to Mr. Harper. Mr. Munroe came gaily forward, and spoke to those nearest him in his clear, cultured voice. "Now, good people, I will give you the privilege of drinking to my wife's health in some very delicious currant wine. We do not believe in stronger beverages, some of us, at least not this evening, but this is a very rare quality, and I know will be enjoyable." There was a laughing gleam in his handsome eyes as he began to pass the glasses, but he had certainly reckoned without regard to his host. A sudden hush fell on the guests, for Mr. Randolph had risen from his chair at the other end of the room, and those who were nearest him saw that his sallow face was very pale. "There is some mistake," he said, speaking steadily and in a voice sufficiently clear to be heard by every one in the room. "My son-in-law is a new member of my family, and may possibly be excused for not knowing my views. But it were discourtesy to my guests not to make them acquainted with them. I am known in this place as an advocate of temperance, of total abstinence. I do not believe in wine made of any kind of fruit, whether it be of currants or grapes. I never offer wine to guests of mine, and never mean to." "Randolph," said Mr. Harper, touching Tom on the shoulder, as the elder Mr. Randolph sat down, "be proud of your father." "I am," said Tom, his eyes glowing. "I'll be hanged if I don't like square out-and-out independence, even when it fires a shot right at me." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Real or Imitation? The next thing they did was to go shopping, Ermina and Faith and Mrs. Munroe. The last named lady was fond of shopping. Once it had been a trial to her, because of the windows and shelves and cases full of beauty that she must needs pass by, but nowadays her purse was well filled. At least it always seemed so to her, unless she came in contact with Faith Halstead. Mrs. Munroe's wealth would always be that of degree. When in the presence of her sisters, with their carefully counted pennies, she felt rich. When she was with Faith, in view of that young lady's $500,000, she was poor, and somewhat discontented. It was this feeling that served to put her in a petulant, argumentative mood whenever she came in contact with Faith. Ermina went shopping because she had a half-holiday, with nothing in particular to do, and she said it was refreshing to look on occasionally and see other people spend money, even though she had none to spend herself. Faith went of necessity, because things would wear out and must necessarily be replaced. In her haste to get settled for the summer, she had left much of her summer sewing to do after she reached her new home. Mrs. Munroe went because, as I told you, she enjoyed it. They were a pretty trio in their cheerful summer toilets. A trifle overdressed Mrs. Munroe was for the street. It was her besetting temptation. But Faith was as simple in her toilet as Ermina herself, and that young lady was wont to remark that severe simplicity became her complexion and her purse. I don't remember whether I have ever told you how Ermina looked. I am anxious that you should know. She had large gray eyes, and hair so brown that sometimes people imagined it to be black. She had a somewhat large mouth, in which one caught glimpses of rows of white teeth. And now you know almost nothing about how she looked. As if eyes and hair and teeth told anything about the look. I wonder what it is. Everybody has eyes, and a quite good many people have hair and teeth of their own, even in these days, and yet we never get mixed up, mistaking other people for our sisters, or our husbands or fathers. The look is there, the distinguishing something that makes each person distinct from every other person. Ermina had the look in a marked degree. No one ever said of her, "There goes one of the Randolph girls." She was Ermina Randolph to everybody that knew her. On this sunny afternoon, as the three ladies took their seats in a street car, Ermina in her plainly made silver gray dress looked every inch a lady. Mrs. Munroe was, as I said, just a little too much dressed, and Faith was so small and slight that every one thought her a fair young girl not out of her teens by some years. The cars filled rapidly, and there presently occurred that interesting condition peculiar to street cars, more people than seats. Among the standers was a woman belonging to that class to whom belongs the term common people, whatever that may mean in this country of free schools and republican principles. I think it generally means that the women wear calico dresses, where the other class wear some other material. A refined distinction, you will observe. This particular woman was in clean, neat, recently starched calico of a quiet, neutral tint. In her arms she carried a plump, well-to-do baby, whose head bobbed from side to side incessantly, partly because of the jar of the car, and partly from his intense desire to see all that was to be seen. She stood opposite Ermina, who indulged in a mental calculation on the probable weight of the child, and then glanced down the car at the row of fashionably dressed young men who were making merry over the personal appearance of some of the passengers. Suddenly Ermina arose, and as the car had stopped to receive a package and a message, her voice could be heard distinctly. "Take my seat, madame. It is difficult to stand and carry a child." And as the woman objected, "I insist, madame. I am abundantly able to stand." Instantly the three young men were on their feet, and the nearest one tendered his seat in unmistakably pressing terms. "No," said our gray-eyed lady, coldly and proudly. "No, thank you. I am quite able to stand, and the lady to whom I gave my seat was not." Mrs. Munroe took her to task for it afterward. "What is the use in being so different from everybody else, Ermina? It certainly isn't your business to provide women and babies with seats. You spoke out so rudely, too, to those gentlemen. The one who spoke to you was General Thornton's son. Did you know him?" "No," said Ermina, decidedly, "and I don't want to. A gentleman would offer his seat to a woman and a baby, provided he felt able to stand at all. I am not quenched, Helen, even by your disapproval. I am glad I spoke out." "Well, I say you were bold and unnecessarily rude. Don't you think so, Faith? I was mortified. It does seem as if we were fated to have something ridiculous or mortifying happen whenever Mr. Harper is present to look on." "Mr. Harper?" Ermina repeated, with a little start. "Where was he? I am sure he was invisible to me." "He was standing on the platform, and saw and heard the whole proceeding, I know by the appearance of his face." "Oh," very composedly. "You studied his face, did you? I am glad he had no seat." "Why in the world are you glad of that?" "Oh, simply because I consider that posture beneficial to health and strength, and I have a benevolent interest in his welfare." Faith laughed. "I am glad, too," she said in an aside to Ermina. "I like him." "Well, I'm sure I hope you are rested for our shopping, after standing for half an hour in a street car. Utterly unnecessary it was, too. I presume that woman is used to standing at the wash tub all day. Faith, did you notice the cotton lace on that child's cloak and hat? I declare, it perfectly disgusts me to see how much people try to imitate us." "Me, for instance," said Ermina, utter unconcern in her voice. "I have an imitation lace ruffle in my dress this minute." Faith laughed again. "So have I," she said brightly, and I think I look very nice in it." "I wonder if you wear imitation lace?" Mrs. Munroe said, utter surprise in her voice. "I am sure it's very pretty. I thought it was real." "That's the beauty of the imitation. I am obliged to judge by the price of it half the time, which proves that the imitation is almost as pretty as the real." "Oh, I can tell it as a general thing," said Mrs. Munroe, with a marked emphasis on the "I." Note: If you know any fashionable lady who never bought half a dozen yards of "real" lace in her life, you may be sure she will be the one to declare her ability to distinguish the real from the counterfeit, even in the dark. "But yours is a remarkable good imitation. Ermina's, now, is almost as bad as that ridiculous woman's. Don't you dislike to see such attempts to deck out a baby? The child would have looked better in calico." "I don't think so," Faith said stoutly. "I liked the poor woman just because she had taken such evident pains to make her baby look pretty. If she cannot have the real things for her darling, she gives him the best that her purse will afford." "That is mere sentiment," Mrs. Munroe said, in an oracular tone. Then they both went into Caswell and Hollister's store. Those gentlemen kept a line of goods not to be found at Munroe's. Ermina was stayed at the very entrance. "What lovely calicoes! I think I never saw any prettier. Helen, they have none like these at your store?" Mrs. Munroe surveyed them coldly. "I'm sure I don't know whether they have or not," she said in an indifferent tone. "They are common 10-cent prints. I don't patronize that class of goods, and never notice whether we have them or not." Ermina's interest increased. "They are only 10 cents?" she questioned eagerly. "That sounds as if it might come within the bounds of my purse, and I really need a couple to sew in. I believe I'll buy some." "Ermina, what nonsense! Cambrics are only 20 cents, and English calicoes you can get for 15. "But if I can get what will answer the same purpose for 10 cents, why shouldn't I?" "They won't answer the same purpose. No one wears those common things." "I do," said Faith, emphatically. "I have two. Paid 10 cents a yard for them in New York. No, I declare, one was 9 cents, and I have them made up beautifully. They are the prettiest dresses I have, in their sphere, you know." Mrs. Munroe gave her rich cousin a stare of genuine astonishment, and questioned her energetically, while Ermina reveled in buff and gray tints among the 10-cent calicoes. "Why in the world do you buy such cheap things, Faith? I'm sure you can't plead economy." "Why not?" Faith asked, good-humoredly. "Why should I waste money because I happen to have more than some people?" "But do you consider buying cambrics a waste of money?" Faith laughed merrily. "What a logician you would make this afternoon," she said. "We are not talking about cambrics. You were denying me the duty of economizing." "Well," Mrs. Munroe said, drawing her Paisley shawl about her shoulders with an impatient jerk, "I suppose you are not so obtuse but that you take my meaning. Do you pretend to say you think common, coarse calicoes are as good as cambrics?" "I don't remember having said anything of the kind, Cousin Helen. There are places to go to where I should rather prefer a cambric dress to a calico. But there are also places where the 10-cent dresses fit in beautifully, and I won't be so silly as to keep myself from buying them merely because they only cost half as much as some other goods. I detest that sort of shoddyism." Ermina laughed. "That is good," she said heartily. "I think you have touched the root of the question. I am just waking up to see it. The price per yard marks the importance of American costumes, and not the pretty at all. Now, for instance, I'm sure anybody with eyes must see that this pale sea-green ground, with dots of deeper green all over it, would be very pretty if it were not for the fatal 10-cent ticket on it. Helen, I'm sorry to shock your taste so deeply, but I must have a dress of this. It suits me, and my pocketbook, two important matters." "There might be another reason given for economical dresses," Faith said, with the faraway look in her eyes. "This whole question of dress is a mysterious and sometimes a painful puzzle to me. Where to draw the line, how far, as responsible stewards, to spend money that is entrusted to our keeping for the simple purpose of adorning our own bodies, I'm sure I don't know. Whether to buy any real lace at all, when there is actual starvation in the world, both of the body and the soul, is a strange query. What do you think, Ermina?" "I never thought about it at all," Ermina answered, bluntly. "I never had any money to buy real lace with, nor real things of any sort, and never expect to have." "But do you never try to make other people's duties plain to them?" Faith asked, with a merry twinkle in her eye. "Plenty of times, so far as their duties toward me were concerned. But I never troubled myself about their relations to the heathen. I should think, though, it would be rather an easy question to settle, if one wanted to settle it conscientiously. It would simply involve a little close looking into things, to discover which was really of the most importance, lace or soul." "What a startling way of putting it!" Faith said, thoughtfully. "What an absurd way of putting it!" Mrs. Munroe said. "Ermina, you are tumbling those prints about in a shocking way. Do come on." "I can't," said Ermina. "I want to buy a dress, I'm sure. I am waiting to be served. The clerks are all busy. Lace is uppermost, you perceive, this afternoon." "But, Ermina, if one really takes that view of the question, where will it end?" This Faith said, speaking earnestly. "Since there really is starvation in the world, why should we have any of the things that we do? It is not a question of real lace and silk and velvet simply, but of merino and poplin, and carpets and pictures, and music and flowers even. Where is the dividing line?" Ermina laughed. "I don't know, I'm sure," she said lightly. "It is a puzzle. I think about it as little as possible, and buy my 10-cent calicoes because I cannot afford any better, and for no other earthly reason." "You are a ridiculous couple," Mrs. Munroe said, shortly. "If you really are going to stay here and tumble over horrid prints, and moralize all the afternoon, why, I'll go on. I came to match blue silk." Mr. Harper had a way of appearing to people at unexpected moments. It was when the green calico had been purchased, and the ladies, returned from a vain search after the right shade of blue silk, halted again before the calico counter, while Faith picked out a dainty morning slip for Pearlie, that he came over to them. "Didn't I hear you puzzling your brains over abstruse questions of starvation and plenty?" he said to Faith in a familiar tone. He and Faith had been friends since the latter's early childhood. "We didn't know that you heard us," she said brightly. "But since you did, perhaps you can help us." "Not very materially, I fear. You must ask my sister about that. She is in town. Did you know it? When will you ladies call on her? There is one sentence, Faith, that might help, I should think. Whether, therefore, ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. Have you thought of that?" "Yes, and it increases the puzzle. We just don't live it. How can we?" "Ask my sister." "Who is his sister?" Mrs. Munroe asked, as they went down Chester Street. "She is Mrs. Laporte, of Boston, daughter of Kenneth J. Carleton, of Washington. I don't know her. They have been abroad since her marriage." "They are immensely rich, are they not?" Mrs. Munroe's tones were respectful. They always were when she spoke of riches. "Very," Faith said, simply. "Humph!" said Ermina. "What can she know about the subject of silks and souls?" Chapter 20 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. A Protector. It was a beautiful room, not small. Mrs. Munroe disliked small rooms, and had as little to do with them as possible. But it was so daintily furnished with household conveniences and comforts as to give an idea of coziness and diminutiveness. The walls were hung with a delicate tint of buff, bordered with a deep maroon, rich maroon carpet on the floor, chairs and sofas and little cunning ottomans all in rich maroon rep. Even the spread for the tiny round table was of the same glowing color. It was Mrs. Munroe's sitting room. There were little corner stands with books and papers and sewing materials, and brackets with vases and flowers. There was everywhere that beautiful, systematic, unstiffness of arrangement which a tasteful lady knows how to bestow upon the family room. In the centre of this fair room sat the lady of the house, her toilette quite in keeping with her surroundings, the colours of her dress blending harmoniously with the prominent colours of the room. Mrs. Munroe had an eye for details. Sometimes, however, the most fastidious lady is obliged to endure contrasts. Mrs. Munroe's companion was a contrast. He sat in one of the luxurious maroon chairs. His hat, tipped on one side, showed plainly that a blow or wound of some sort had blackened his left eye. His coat was torn away in front, as if he had rescued it from a rude grasp. His boots were thick with black, filthy-looking mud. His face was flushed, an unnatural red, and his breathing, or rather snoring, had a strange, unnatural sound. Mrs. Munroe had let her Java canvas slip from her silken dress to the floor, and sat with clasped hands, looking steadily at the sleeping object before her. It was perfectly plain to any looker-on that his sleep was that which is caused by taking a glass too much. A drunken man! Well, if he were only Jim Smith, living over the wretched little corner rum-hole, that would be the proper name to use, but inasmuch as he was Mr. Horace Munroe, of the firm of Evans, Munroe and Company, people hesitated, and generally said that he was a little overcome with liquor. There were no tears in his wife's eyes. Helen Munroe was not one who had tears to spare for many occasions. This one did not call them forth. But if you have never pitied her in your life, I hope you do now. She needs pity. It is an old story. It has been repeated until it is familiar to every one, and I think we American people must enjoy its recital, we take such pains to manufacture just such homes as these. I suppose it never grows commonplace to the suffering wife. There were features about this family life that made it peculiarly terrible. Mrs. Munroe had in the place of an absorbing love, such as the marriage relation should be built upon, only a composed, quiet friendship for her husband. Perhaps you think that would make the trial less hard. I tell you I don't think so. I have known drunkards' wives clinging to their husbands with almost godlike pity and patience as they sank from one depth to another, and those wives were sustained by that blessed love that God had given them for their husbands. It enabled them to bear up under trials that would otherwise have crushed them, to cling where they would otherwise have spurned, to hope when others despaired. I say it was harder for Mrs. Munroe because she did not love her husband. She liked the position that he had given her. She liked her beautiful home and all its tasteful appointments. But sitting there that evening, looking at the red-faced, swollen-eyed, filthy creature whose name she bore, whose wife she was, she hated the very sight of him. And if there is anything more terrible in all this pitiful earth than that, I don't know what it can be. I have heard people tell of what strange and queer, and sometimes trivial, thoughts come to them when they believed themselves to be drowning. Some of the thoughts of this young wife were equally strange. She sat, with dry, wide-open eyes, and stared at her husband. How strange that such a pitiable wretch should bear that name! "Love, honor, and protect," she said, repeating a scrap of the marriage service which came to her just then, repeating it with curling lips of scorn. The city clock struck 9. She counted the strokes from the force of newly acquired habit. She compared the time with her little gold watch, which was a present from her husband. Always, in the house nearly across the street, as the clock struck 9, the head of the house took down the family Bible, and the household gathered for prayers. Suppose it was their custom in this family, how would they manage it this evening? "He is much too drunk to kneel," she said aloud, and then she laughed, a terrible laugh. Such natures as Helen Munroe's are sometimes brought, through heavy trial and pain, to kneel in utter self-abnegation, and find peace. Sometimes such natures as hers are brought to madhouses through like trials. Her laugh was like that. She went on with her half-insane thoughts. What if he were not my husband? What if he were some miserable street loafer who had blundered in here? I wonder what I should do with him? I should probably scream to my husband to protect me from him. But who is there to protect me from my husband? Then she laughed again. Perhaps I should kill him. Perhaps I shall, anyway. Then I should be a widow. But I don't think murder would be a very hard thing to do. I can think of worse things. The front door bell rang. There was a slipping of bolts and voices in the hall. The girls, a foolish young second girl, it was Rebecca's evening out, and a gentleman's. Mrs. Munroe heard neither bell nor voices. She heard her husband's breathing. The girl knew that her mistress was in the sitting-room, and that Mr. Munroe had recently come in. That was all she knew. Nothing was more natural than that she should throw open the door of the sitting-room to Mr. Harper. He came forward with quick step and cheerful voice. "Good evening, Mrs. Munroe. I fear I am intruding on the quiet of family life, but I have a little item of business of some importance. Can I see your husband?" Mrs. Munroe was a woman of two natures. One was made up of fierce, strong pride. She sprang to her feet, her first impulse to take Mr. Harper by the shoulders and thrust him from the room. Any one but him! Oh, for that man to know the depths to which she had fallen, was the bitterness of horror. Her second thought was the utter impossibility of keeping secret their dreadful condition, and the utter incongruity of his errand. She laughed in his face that fearful laugh. "It is an infinite pity to have disturbed such delightful family communion as ours. I hardly know how to forgive you. Oh, yes, you can see my husband. I presume he will be very happy to discuss important business with you. There he is." All this in almost a moment of time, and she pointed her scornful finger at the sleeping man. Mr. Harper wheeled in bewilderment, following the pointing finger. One glance at Mr. Munroe's face and dress and position, and he comprehended the situation. Then an almost infinite pity took possession of him, and an almost equal embarrassment. What to do, what to say, rather what not to say. He stood in utter silence and dismay until a glance at an opposite mirror, in which was reflected Mrs. Munroe's stony face, recalled to him the necessity of doing something. He turned to her. "Mrs. Munroe, nothing can justify my intrusion upon you, but the hope that I can do something for you. In what way can I best help you?" "I want no help," she said, with hardness in her voice. "What help is there for me?" "May I bring some one to you, your brother or sisters?" Again Mrs. Munroe laughed. "My brother!" she said in an utterly scornful tone. "He is probably in the same delightful condition. They have been on a pleasure excursion, you understand. As for my sisters, they are the last persons on the face of the earth that I want to see. No, thank you. My husband is my legal protector. I must look to him for help." Mr. Harper actually shivered. "Don't," he said in a pleading tone. "It is a bitter trial, but don't receive it in this way. You are only making the burden heavier. May I help him to his room and make him comfortable?" "No," she said fiercely. "You may not. Comfortable! What does it matter?" "But what are you going to do?" "Nothing. Let him finish his nap. I hope he will waken in a refreshed state of mind." "But, dear madame, he is your husband." "I know it," she said in a husky voice. "God pity me." Still Mr. Harper stood irresolute. To leave her in loneliness and in such a state of heart seemed impossible. To remain longer with the insulted wife and the drunken husband seemed equally impossible. "May I not go for your father?" he asked with a sudden hope in his heart. Mrs. Munroe's lip quivered, but she resolutely shook her head. "Not for the world. This would kill my father. Besides, he warned me. No, Mr. Harper, I am utterly alone." "Never that," he said earnestly. "You have the unfailing, ever-present friend, the one who knows your sorrow. May I not beseech you to carry this burden to him?" "I never understood such talk," she said bitterly. "It never comforted me in the least. It doesn't now. God has everything in his hands. He can control the world. Why does he permit such burdens to come upon people? Why does he allow my husband to make a beast of himself? Would you allow it, if you could help it? And are you more humane than God?" Mr. Harper hesitated. It was such a strange time for the discussion of theological questions. "Dear madame," he said, speaking very gently, "when you accepted Christ as your friend, did you not engage to take some things on trust, to believe that what you could not see was yet clear to the eye and the heart of your Saviour, and that he ruled?" "No," she said passionately, "I don't see it at all. It seems to me exactly as though Satan ruled. Who but he could make such an object of my husband as that? And if his plans succeed, instead of God's, which is the greater?" "They will not succeed," he said quietly, "unless you let them. God is on your side. He will surely deliver you if you trust in him. If you turn from him, how can he help you?" She had quieted again, but answered him sullenly. "I know very well he needn't have made a brute of himself unless he had chosen. But having chosen to do so, I don't see how I can help it." "Have you tried to help it?" he asked eagerly. "Mrs. Munroe, your husband is not a Christian, but he has a Christian wife. God has put a powerful weapon into your hands. Do you use it to the utmost?" "I suppose you mean, do I pray for him?" she said coldly. "Why, yes, of course I pray for my husband. But you see how much good it has done thus far. There is something besides praying to be done in this world." "That is painfully true. I wonder if you and I are doing our very utmost. Until we are, we should not dare lay the unfinished work upon God. Mrs. Munroe, may I not go for your cousin Faith?" Mrs. Munroe shivered visibly. "Not for the world," she said with energy. "She is the last person that I want to see triumphing over my downfall. I will have no one. And if you please, Mr. Harper, I will not detain you longer. Some things are better endured alone." "Alone with God," he said gently. And then the bell pealed through the house again. Mrs. Munroe roused suddenly to outside life. "Mr. Harper, I beg you to spare me from seeing any one. Say anything. We are sick, dying, anything you like. Only don't let any one into this house." More and more bewildered by the strangeness of his position, Mr. Harper moved promptly toward the hall, but the watchful servant had preceded him, and was admitting Ermina and Maria Randolph. "Good evening," he said, coming toward them. "Miss Randolph, you are fortunately just the person whom I wish to see in regard to a little business matter. Will you both oblige me by stepping into the parlor a moment? That will do," he added to the girl, as she turned on a flood of light. "Where is Helen?" asked Ermina, wonderingly, as Mr. Harper closed the door after the retreating servant. He turned toward her. "She is in trouble," he said briefly, "and, I am afraid, does not want to see even you." "That would be an extraordinary state of mind," Maria began lightly, but her sister interrupted her. "Has Horace come home? Is he—" Then she stopped. Mr. Harper bowed in utter silence. "Oh, poor Helen!" Ermina said, but Maria's voice had no tenderness. "She was warned," she said, hoarsely. "She must have known what would come. It is not as hard for her as it was for father, with his only son. Mr. Harper, do you know anything about our brother Tom? He and Horace were together." Mr. Harper did not know. Judging from Mr. Munroe's state, he could only surmise. He sat down on a sofa opposite to the one whereon Ermina had sunken when she made her one exclamation. What a white, frightened face she had! Maria noticed it, and her own seemed to grow harder. "What a delightful world it is!" she said in great bitterness. "So much sunshine and happiness! Everything moves along so comfortably. I wonder there are any infidels." "Hush!" said Mr. Harper, with stern dignity. "For the miseries that people bring upon themselves, it is weak and wicked to blame God." She turned toward him. Perhaps my father brought his troubles upon himself," she said fiercely. "The best and tenderest man on earth, unselfish and patient and long-suffering. Don't you dare to say that my father's trials are of his own making." Mr. Harper's voice was less severe, but it was still firm. "Your father is God's own child, and is safe in his hands. I am sure that he trusts him, and his daughter should do no less. Your father would not like to hear you call in question his Maker's work." "I am doing nothing of the sort, Mr. Harper. I am simply enraged at some of his subjects. At you and Ermina, for instance, who profess to have such unbounded faith in prayer. And what do you accomplish by it? Oh, I wish I knew how to pray. I would pray this sum of all horrors out of the world." Something in her earnest words surprised and silenced Mr. Harper, and Ermina said impulsively, "I wish she did. She was always the one to accomplish in our family. The rest of us talk. Maria does it." "There is great force in what your sister has just said," Mr. Harper answered, addressing Ermina, as she had him. "I do not wonder that people are surprised at our apparent inconsistencies. It is true that we accomplish very little with our mighty weapon, but it is not strange. A weapon cannot be expected to accomplish anything unless it is used. We all desire to do something for your sister and your brothers. Let us do the only thing that we can do. Let us pray. Miss Maria, I ask you to begin with us the lesson that you said you wished you knew." Then the three knelt down, and Mr. Harper prayed. All three of these people had been acting somewhat unlike their usual selves. Both the sisters lived a life of repression, so far as their inner selves were concerned. Both had been moved to speak a sentence or two from their hearts. Mr. Harper was not given to harshness, but his sense of reverence had been rudely shocked, and his voice had responded. Their present position together, kneeling in the parlor of their sister's house, was certainly not an ordinary one, and a less intensely in earnest party might have wondered what they would be likely to do next. They slipped, however apparently without jar, into their ordinary selves. "Would we better go in and see Helen?" Ermina asked her sister as they arose, and Maria answered in her usual composed tone, "No, we can do no good, and of course she don't want to see us. Let us go home." "Then I will walk over with you," Mr. Harper said. "I am coming back here to make Mr. Munroe comfortable, and if you are needed for anything we'll let you know." As he left them at their own door, he said, "Miss Maria, won't you pray for your brother Tom to-night?" "No," said Maria, with great seriousness, "but I will ask Faith Halsted to do so. That will be much more to the point." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A puzzling discussion. The kitchen was as usual the scene of conflict. Maria was shelling peas. Faith, in the doorway, tried to help, but everybody who has undertaken to help at anything, and at the same time look after the movements of a boy a year and a half old, knows just how much such help amounts to. Mrs. Munroe did not even try. She stood leaning against the pillar of the side piazza, her cool blue and white dress fluttering in the summer wind, her head resting just where a bright morning glory touched her ear. She looked as if trial and pain and care had nothing in common with her. Maria was talking, of course. "It is a great nuisance, anyway," she was saying. "I'm sorry I joined. I'm sure I don't know why I did, unless it was because father had a notion that my duty lay in that direction. I can't see where duty can consist in making scarlet dogs with square noses and yellow mouths. I always hated worsted dogs, anyway." Faith laughed merrily. Maria's views of people and things were very funny to her, but Mrs. Munroe looked dignified. "That is a very silly way to talk," she said solemnly. "Why wouldn't it be your duty to help sustain the church society? You attend church there, and Ermina is a member. Of course, part of the work ought to fall on you. I'm sure you needn't make worsted cats and dogs, or worsted anything, unless you choose. You can make aprons or nightcaps if they suit your taste better. But I think it is manifestly your duty to help sustain the society, especially when its object is to help pay a church debt." "A church fiddlestick!" said Maria, decisively. "That makes me the maddest of any part of it. If the work was of any earthly importance, if they made check aprons for poor children, or flannel petticoats for sick old women, I'd tolerate it, and sew all the afternoon, much as I hate it. But this meeting together every other week for a year to make yellow pincushions and green roses, and every imaginable kind of flummery that comes under the general name of fancy work, and then getting up a great big fair and charging 3 times as much for a thing as ought to be charged, and having 3 or 4 gambling establishments for side shows, and doing it all in the name of the church debt, when each one who works for the concern, by paying in money half of what she gives every year for worsted and canvas and beads and cardboard, could wipe the church debt out of existence and have no fuss about it, I don't believe in." And the strong-minded young woman shoveled the shelled peas into her pan, and swept the pods away with energy. Faith laughed again. Maria's ideas were so queer and so jumbled. Mrs. Munroe still sustained her character for dignity. "Oh, yes," she said coldly. "Of course you know more about such matters than all the rest of the church combined. I wonder they don't come to you for advice." "Well, now, haven't I told the truth? What are all the suppers and pincushions and grab bags for? Isn't there a much easier way of raising money, if that is the object? I'll prove it to you. I'm on committee for baking cakes. I didn't count my time, nor Faith's, nor Pearlie's, and they all helped, Pearlie especially. But just for fun, or for my own satisfaction, I kept an account of material, eggs, flour, butter, milk, fruit, and hair oil, as Tom calls the flavoring, and what do you think it amounted to? Just $2.95. Now suppose I save my firewood and my time and my apron, and give that $2.95 to the society. And suppose the ones who are to make the biscuit, and furnish meat, and pickles, and cheese, and milk and coffee, and the land knows what, do the same, wouldn't the church be richer than if we make a dozen cats and dogs this afternoon, and eat my cake and Nettie Thatcher's biscuits in the bargain?" "But you wouldn't do any such thing." "Wouldn't do what?" "Why, give your money. There isn't one lady in 50 would take $3 out of her pocket and give it outright for the church debt, but any of them will make cake." "Then it must be because we are all poor mathematicians, or fools," said Maria, with increased energy. "If our object is to pay the church debt, we can certainly do it quicker in my way. But if our object is to meet in the chapel and eat cake and pickles, I say let the object be distinctly stated, and don't let us make ourselves think that we are a benevolent institution when we are actually eating up money." Faith had listened and laughed through this talk, keeping silence herself. As she brought Pearlie back from a raid after the gray cat, and tied his shoes, she took up the conversation. "That's a dreadfully one-sided argument, Maria. Mrs. Munroe, why don't you present the other side of the question?" "Oh, I never argue with her," said Mrs. Munroe, with strong emphasis on the her. "There's no sort of use in it. She has views of her own about everything earthly, and she will maintain them in spite of fate." "That isn't so," said Maria, good-humoredly. "I am willing to be convinced if any one will take the trouble, but you see Helen doesn't. She just says 'nonsense,' or something of that sort. Now I appeal to you, Faith. Haven't I told the truth?" "Only part of it," Faith said. "I believe in sewing societies, but not for any of the reasons which you have mentioned. If they were only intended for the purpose of raising money, I should, like yourself, consider them very ludicrous inventions." "What on earth are they for?" "I think for the cultivation of our social qualities, for the purpose of mingling together as a church, socially. There are those in every society who would never meet, never know each other, if it were not for the social gatherings." "Then why don't they call them social tea parties, and not sewing societies?" "Oh, because it is human nature, and a very nice, commendable nature, too, I think, to like to be doing something pleasant and something useful at the same time. Give us a mutual object in which to be interested, and what is more likely to interest us than sewing for our own church? Unless indeed we have risen to a higher plane than that, and are sewing for the Church of Christ. Besides, there is another point, as Helen says. You won't give the money out and out, but you are willing to give the work. People need to be educated to systematic giving, even if the giving is only some loaves of cake. So that they are given regularly, at set times, a point has been gained. Now, Maria, you said you were ready to be convinced. Have you been? Partly and partly not, said Maria, as she added more water to the peas. The social idea is a good one, and I'll think better of the institutions hereafter for its sake. But there's a flaw in them, as you would see if you were going to ours this afternoon. Aren't you going? Said Mrs. Munroe. Faith shook her head. Pearlie doesn't approve of sewing societies, she said. I'm sorry, because I want to see Maria hunt for the flaws. I'll find them, Maria said positively. Oh, I know you will. Flaws are the easiest things to find in the world if you only look for them. So Ermina and Maria went to society. Maria, as she had said, rarely went, unless she was on committee and had the work to do. Ermina rarely during these days had opportunity to go, but this chanced to be a time of less haste than usual in the sewing-room. In the course of the afternoon, Maria and Carrie Hartley sat together. Carrie was making a tidy, a pretty thing of wreaths and leaves, creations of split zephyr. "Isn't it lovely?" she said, holding it up to view. "I am perfectly wild over fancy work. They do have such a poky old society over at the Willard Street Church. I went there yesterday with Nellie Thayer. They were making calico aprons and horrid sacks, and knitting stockings, and oh, dear, I don't know what. They were filling a stupid box for some old fogey missionary. Shouldn't you think such a society as that would be horrid?" "Perfectly," said Maria solemnly. "Why should old fogey home missionaries be sewed for? Such worthless and useless beings as they are. Tidies and mats and cushions are what we need in this world. Who cares for missionaries?" Miss Carrie stared incredulously at her companion. "Of course missionaries are useful and all that," she said after a little, "and ought to be sewed for. But then I think charity begins at home, don't you? Now our church needs a new carpet. I am really ashamed of the old one, it is faded and worn considerably, and I think we need new chairs for the pulpit. I hate red chairs, they are in bad taste. We ought to fix up our own church." "Of course," Maria assented. "The idea of supposing that those wretched home missionaries, with their stockingless feet and their arms out at the elbows, are of more importance than our red chairs, when we ought to have green ones, is an utter absurdity. I don't know why we should care whether the gospel is preached to the prairie heathens or not, so long as we need a new carpet." Miss Carrie laughed faintly. "What a funny girl you are," she said, and presently she went to her particular friend, Addie Wilson, and said, "You ought to have heard the berating that Maria Randolph gave me because I said we needed a new church carpet. Isn't she a queer girl?" That is about as correctly as things are reported in this world. Mrs. Wheeler, the president of the society, was absent. Little Mrs. Clay, the vice president, was to fill her place. At 5 o'clock she went from one lady to another in considerable flurry, and apparently what she said to each produced some consternation. "Oh, I can't," one lady said. "My dear Mrs. Clay, you must excuse me." "I never did such a thing in my life," murmured another. "It is quite impossible, utterly impossible. I couldn't if it were to save my life," said another. "What in the world does she want them to do?" questioned Maria of her neighbor. "It must be something terrific. They are getting up quite a commotion." "Why," said the neighbor, "she wants some one to read the Bible and pray. Such an idea! Mrs. Wheeler always does it." Maria laughed outright. "What an excitement!" she said in mirthful sarcasm. Every one of those ladies members of the church. I declare I don't see but one individual besides myself who is not, and they won't one of them pray for the success of their undertaking. What is the use of their knowing how? They must be dreadfully out of practice, or they wouldn't be thrown into such confusion." And the next sentence was addressed to Maria herself by the flurried Mrs. Clay. "My dear Miss Randolph, won't you be so kind as to lead our devotional exercises this afternoon? Mrs. Wheeler cannot be present, and it devolves upon me to supply her place. I should be so much obliged if you would." "I presume you mean my sister," said Maria, coolly, inclining her head toward Ermina, who sat at her left. "She is Miss Randolph, and she is a church member, and so is supposed to know how to pray. For myself, I have never learned." Mrs. Clay turned quickly. "Oh, Miss Randolph, would you be so kind?" Ermina's lips were opened for a refusal. Maria's eyes were dancing with fun. Mrs. Munroe was regarding her with a vexed air. She herself had just given a somewhat ungracious refusal. Ermina had never tried to pray before anyone in her life. Judging from what you know of her daily living, perhaps you can tell how much she was accustomed to daily, searching, private prayers. Of course she would refuse. But there came just then, strangely enough, to her mind a sentence that Mr. Harper had let drop in her hearing but a few days before. "One reason why our friends are not converted is because we, their leaders, walk so crookedly that we keep them all the time stumbling over us." Was Maria stumbling over her? "I don't know whether I am a Christian or not," said Ermina to herself, "but I profess to be one. And whether I am or not, it can't hurt me to pray. Now, I'm not naturally timid. Why should I be afraid to try?" All this in a second of time. Then she said to Mrs. Clay, with great composure in her voice, "I never did such a thing in my life, but I presume it won't hurt me. I'll do it." And she moved forward to where the formidable pulpit Bible awaited her. Opening it at random, and beginning to read in haste to cover her confusion, she presently found herself in the midst of words like these: "He hath not dealt with us after our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities." An almost overpowering sense of the truth of this sentence came upon her. What if God had dealt with her according to her sins? "As far as the east is from the west, so far hath he removed our transgressions from us." How tender and precious and patient were the words! She had never noticed them closely before. Her heart melted over them. "Like as a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him." To one who had a father like Ermina Randolph's, that verse meant a great deal. She stopped with that, feeling that she, at least, had had enough. She said, with a quiet voice, but with a tumultuous heart, "Let us pray," and felt rather than saw that the ladies were kneeling around her. On her 10th birthday Ermina had learned and recited to her father certain verses. They came back to her now. Very slowly, very solemnly, she repeated them. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit. Then will I teach transgressors thy ways, and sinners shall be converted unto thee. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God, thou God of my salvation, and my tongue shall sing aloud of thy righteousness." Just here she stopped. What wonderful things she had asked! What solemn things she had promised! Did she really mean them? How dare she say more? A solemn silence filled the house for a moment, and then with one more sentence from lips that quivered, "God forgive me and help me for Jesus' sake," she arose. Every word of her prayer had been personal. She did not notice it. She did not even take time to think of the singularity of her position. It seemed to her at the moment that there were but two beings in existence, herself and God. The buzz of conversation commenced again, but she stood apart, as one dazed. It seemed to her that she could not go back and hem the strings for that white apron. She felt as if she must go away alone and repeat those words, "Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me." "If only I knew whether I had any right to pray at all," she said, pushing her hair back from her throbbing temples. "I surely thought I was a Christian, but I don't know. I really don't know anything. How fearfully solemn those sentences were!" There had been an arrival during the Bible reading, a tall, fair lady in a plain black suit. She was evidently a person of some importance, for respectful and curious glances followed her as she moved to and fro. Something about her face attracted Ermina. She leaned down to her friend Nettie Thatcher and said, "Who is that woman with eyes?" "With eyes?" said Nettie, laughing. "Is there only one person in the room meriting that description?" "I don't see but one. If you want anything more descriptive, she is talking with Mrs. Colonel Hitchcock." "Oh, that is Mr. Harper's sister." About that time the lady in question said, abruptly, "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Hitchcock, but tell me the name of the lady who offered prayer." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Light. "There is one young lady in that society that I attended yesterday, Warren, who needs my help," said Mrs. Laporte, as she stirred her coffee slowly and thoughtfully. "Only one?" answered Mr. Harper, laughing. "I expected you to find at least a dozen." "There were interesting faces, but this one is in trouble." "Who is she?" "Her name is Randolph. I did not learn much more about her. Mrs. Hitchcock, with whom I was sitting, seemed to know very little about her." "Which of the Randolphs is she?" "Are there two of them? I only saw this one. She led the devotional exercises." Mr. Harper opened his eyes very wide. "I do not know which of them it can be," he said quickly. "Grace and Maria are neither of them Christians, and Miss Ermina— I know, it was probably their cousin, Miss Faith." "It was Ermina," Mrs. Laporte said, positively. "I remember hearing someone speak her name." "I don't think it could have been," her brother answered, quite as positively. "I am sure she would never have led in devotional exercises. You have mixed the people up. It was some other young lady." "Warren, I never mix up a face that looks just as hers did, and I want to meet her. You must take me to call." "In the evening?" "Why, no. You know I can't go out evenings just now." "She is engaged during the day. She is a sewing girl." "Is she? Then she must come to me. She can come to tea and have a quiet little evening with me afterward. And you'll see that she gets home. Won't you, Warren?" "I could," said Mr. Harper quietly. "But, Louise, there are people who will think it very strange in you to single out one young lady and invite her to tea, while you ignore all the others." "Warren," said Mrs. Laporte, as she pushed away her empty coffee cup, "I don't mean to ignore anybody, and you know I don't care for what they think about my doings. You will manage this matter for me, will you not?" "Why, I'll try," replied Mr. Harper, as he arose. "But, Louise, you keep me in perpetual wonderment as to what out-of-the-way thing you will require of me next." Mrs. Laporte smiled as she responded, "An effort to help any one who needs help ought not to be an out-of-the-way matter." So it came about that Ermina Randolph, standing before her mirror, the same in which Helen had so complacently surveyed herself in the lavender silk, combed out the dark hair, while Mrs. Munroe sat by the window with a discontented expression on her fair face. Presently she asked, "Ermina, how in the world did she come to invite you to tea?" "She didn't come. It was Mr. Harper who came." "Well, Mr. Harper, then." "He came on foot, I think," said Ermina, provokingly. "Don't talk nonsense," was Mrs. Munroe's impatient remark. "You understand what I mean. How happened she to single you out for the favor?" I have not the honor of the lady's confidence to the degree that enables me to answer that question. All I know is that Mr. Harper invited me in his sister's name, and I'm going if I ever get ready." "Well, all I have to say is, don't be too sure of a good time. The old aunt will take you in from head to foot." "Oh, didn't I tell you Mrs. Laporte is boarding at the Sage House? Mr. Harper said that his sister was unwilling to add to her household." Mrs. Munroe toyed listlessly with the curtain tassel, admiring the dainty fingers set off with brilliant jewels, but the dissatisfied expression still lingered. "How do you happen to know so much about her affairs? Who told you?" "Mr. Harper did." "He seems to be very communicative. He must think you are immensely interested in what concerns them." "It was a remarkable thing that he should tell me to come up to the Sage House to tea, instead of going a mile out to his aunt's, and then add to it that his sister wouldn't allow their aunt to have any more company, and so boarded in town." "She isn't his sister at all. She is only a half-sister." "I can't help it. He told me where she boards, if she isn't his sister. And they think as much about each other as if they were double brother and sister instead of half. Pin this ribbon, won't you, Helen? I am late, but I told them I wouldn't come from my sewing until 6. "You must drag in your sewing at every possible moment. What was the use of saying that?" Ermina laughed. "I don't drag it in," she said, good-humoredly. "It drags me. There is no getting away from it, either physically or mentally." "We'll go down to the hotel table, shall we not?" Mrs. Laporte said, as the gong sounded. "Would you like it better than tea in my room?" "Yes," said Ermina, speaking out her mind as usual. "I never took tea at a splendid hotel. I should like it." "Everything is very pleasant about the house, and there are some very pretty ladies among the boarders. Do you like to look at pretty faces?" "Yes," said Ermina, smiling. "I like to, but I didn't suppose it was proper to say so." "Why in the world shouldn't you?" "Oh, I don't know. I thought we must be indifferent to beauty, superior to it, you know." "I hope never to become so," Mrs. Laporte said, laughing. "Why, dear friend, don't you suppose there will be wonderful beauty in heaven?" "I don't know," Ermina said, her face suddenly clouding. "I know precious little about heaven, and what I do know has extremely little to do with beauty. But your question in some way reminds me of what your brother said we must ask you." "What is that? I hope he isn't trying to puzzle me. He is very fond of that occupation." "It is we who are puzzled, my cousin Faith and I. You were to enlighten us. It is the old question of expenditure, where necessities end and luxuries commence, and how far tastes are to be gratified; whether starving bodies and souls, or aesthetic tastes, are to be uppermost." Mrs. Laporte drew a long breath. "It is an immense question," she said. "I don't wonder you were bewildered. I know I often am. I hardly know why Warren should have sent you to me. It is one of my puzzles. In fact, I am right in the midst of it. I struggled over it terribly until I suddenly discovered that what made it so strangely complicated was, I was trying to solve it for everybody. When I stopped that, and went to work in my own little corner of it, it was still sufficiently confusing, but not nearly so bad." Ermina looked with a steady, earnest gaze at the earnest face before her. "I wish," she said, speaking with intense energy, "I wish I could ask you ever so many questions." "You may. I like to ask questions myself. I'm always doing so. I give you the right to ask me any question you please." "Then I don't think you understand what I mean. It is like this. For instance, you have a silk dress on?" "I understand you perfectly. Why don't I wear a calico instead? That is one of my bewilderments. In the first place, then, I have to go to places where people would think that I insulted them if I came in so simple a dress." "But why should they? If everybody wore them, think of the saving." "I know it. But now you see you are trying to straighten other people's tangles. Everybody won't, and you and I can't make them. We have to take the world as we find it. So you must grant me that I thought I ought to have a nice dress. Now for the rest of the story. I made my dress something of a study. I paid a great deal for it. In the first place, I got it of Mr. Hampton. It is not fashionable to trade there. Mr. Hampton is a young man. He cannot buy largely. He hasn't an immense variety. He is struggling to do business on perfectly strict principles, which makes his progress much slower. I buy my dresses there for all these reasons. I know I have helped Mr. Hampton more in buying silk than in buying calico. Then I had it made at Kate Morgan's. She is a quiet little sewing girl who has nice taste and conscientious principles. Nobody would trust her with their silk dresses to make. They gave her their calicoes, and calicoes were not profitable dresses to make, for the reason that being only calico, people will not pay much for having them made. I give her my silks. She does them well, and others are discovering it. I see, said Ermina, gravely. There is a principle underlying it all. It is the first time I ever imagined that there could be any principle in silk dresses. Then there is another view of it, you know. My silk dress costs much more than a pretty cambric, but it will last much longer. I know, but if such expensive materials could be utterly banished, wouldn't there be a saving of money? I don't feel quite sure even of that, because as soon as you make it fashionable not to wear silk and poplin, and take up cambrics and muslins, they immediately become the fashionable, and so the expensive goods. That belongs to other people's part of the confusion, the part which we cannot control. And now, my dear, the second gong is sounding. We must go down to tea. I shall be ready for the other questions when we return. I don't need to ask them, Ermina said, smiling. I can pick it out for myself. I see it as a regular geometrical problem, but based on a real foundation, and I can study it out. Only this, is there, or do you arrange all your expenses in the same way? I try to. Bonnets are to be bought of those who are trying to make honest, honorable bonnets, and who are meeting with difficulties and reverses. There are such people everywhere, if only you will take the trouble to look for them. But, Mrs. Laporte, I couldn't work from your standpoint. I haven't the money. It is not my standpoint that you ought to work from, my friend. You have a foothold, and should have an outlook of your own. Two persons hardly ever commenced at the same point to work out an intricate pattern in embroidery, but the work is the same when completed. Your motto and mine, and the motto of all Christ's followers, is alike. Whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. I don't see how my long and short seams that I am perpetually making on a sewing machine can glorify God, I'm sure, Ermina said, somewhat moodily, as she followed her hostess down the long winding stairs. Don't you? Mrs. Laporte said, smiling back at her from the first landing. If you are careful that the machine skips no stitches, leaves no treacherous ends of thread, and is, in short, as perfect in its work as you can make it, do you not prove that you are a conscientious worker? And is not a proven, conscientious Christian glorifying God in the spot where he has placed her? Ermina laughed. That would make glorified work of the very sweeping and dusting and dishwashing of life, if only one could feel it, she said, trying to speak lightly. But her eyes shone a little as she said, in a softened voice, It is beautiful theory, anyhow. It is more than theory, Mrs. Laporte said, emphatically. It is Bible. Do all to the glory of God. There must be a way to make the glory. This was not the most important conversation that occurred during that evening. The talk which had the most to do with Ermina's life during all her future had its summing up in a few sentences which Mr. Harper spoke as he walked with her down the brightly lighted streets of the city. Did you receive any enlightenment in regard to the question which puzzled you when I met you downtown? He asked, and Ermina was prompt with her answer. On that and on many other questions. Yes, there is light, but it doesn't light me. Such talk is utterly new to me. I never knew that Christianity meant so much. I know it means nothing of the kind to me, so I cannot be a Christian at all. Unconsciously to herself, perhaps, Ermina had been hiding behind this shadow, feeling that somehow it lessened the weight of pain and responsibility. If such living was Christianity, why, then it could not be that she was a Christian. If she were not, why, then she could not be expected to live according to the Christian rule. But she had been a professor of religion for 10 years. People thought, of course, she was a Christian. She expected Mr. Harper to say something of the sort, and she was prepared to combat his words, to prove to him that such living as hers could not be called by that honored name. And then she hoped and believed that he would assure her that there were different degrees of attainment in the Christian life, that all could not be expected to live alike, and so soothe the pain and unrest of her weary life. She was not prepared for the quiet, gentle, penetrating question, "Do you not wish to be?" How simple the question was, and yet how strangely solemn. Did she? She felt the thrill of her own repeated query in every nerve. Oh, she certainly did, wished it so much that she wanted the privilege of clinging to the miserable little rag of hope that she had. "You know if you do," he said, not waiting for her audible answer. "The way is so simple and plain before you. In one sense it is of very little consequence whether you were a Christian yesterday or not. The important point is, will you be one to-night?" "To-night?" she repeated. How strangely that narrowed one down. Why didn't he say to-morrow? That was so near at hand, and yet it gave one a breathing space. He answered the thought embodied in the tones of her voice. "Yes, to-night, because to-morrow is not yours. It is a very commonplace expression, yet did you ever think how true it was? Did you ever think of the many commonplace, apparent trifles around you, either of which might cause your death in a moment? I sometimes think of them, and try to calculate their number, until I am amazed that we escape them and live on. Now, if you really are uncertain as to whether the question between you and God is unsettled, it is folly in you to be unafraid of death. You are a reasonable being. You have perceptive faculties. Therefore, with the momentous question of life unsettled, of course you are afraid to go away from life. If there were no other motive to prompt you, this reasonable fear of being called before you are ready to answer should lead you to determine the question to-night. Will you?" They stood on the doorstep now, and Ermina Randolph will never forget the throbs of her heart as she waited, trying to answer the question to her own heart. Her intense, positive nature shrank from committals of any sort. He varied the question a little. "Will you tell me your decision the next time I meet you? And neither of us are able to tell so simple a thing about our lives as when or where that will be." The question seemed almost as hard to answer as the other, but she answered it after a little with a steady, resolute ring in her voice. "Yes, I will." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. A Discussion Closed. "There is no use in continuing this discussion, Mr. Munroe. I am quite decided as to my views." "Discussion?" repeated Mr. Munroe, speaking a little crossly. His fine temper was being somewhat injured by the atmosphere of his home life. "It might as well be continued on that subject as any other. We live in a state of discussion from week to week." "I am quite willing to discontinue it whenever it shall please you to give me a chance. But as for living in this disgusting fashion any longer, I simply am not going to do it. I did not promise to marry a drunkard, and I have no intention of being a drunkard's wife." They were at tea-table, and Mr. Munroe set down his cup with a ring, and spoke sternly. "It would puzzle me, Helen, to tell what you did marry me for. It couldn't have been for love, though your promises were solemn enough. But I suppose they amount to about as much as other promises made in church. I'll be hanged if you ever gave me reason to think you wasted such a commodity as love on me. If you wanted my money instead of me, why, I'm sure I give you enough of that. Now why can't you be content and let a fellow alone?" "Because, as I said before, whatever other foolish thing I may have done, I did not marry a drunkard, and I will not be a drunkard's wife. I hope you understand me." "I have heard you talk often enough to understand you. You certainly do not obscure your meaning with tender words. I'm not sure but it would be policy to be a drunkard out and out. At least I couldn't be expected to listen to discussions." "Suppose you try it," Mrs. Munroe said, with flashing eyes, but perfect composure in her voice. "Try it twice more, and see how quickly I will leave your establishment to take care of itself. I'm thankful that I have a home and a father." Mr. Munroe arose suddenly. His wife's composed words seemed to sting his heart. "Perhaps you would like to try it," he said angrily. "I'm not sure that you would care, provided I had to keep your purse full. I don't know but we would both be happier. This is a villainous sort of life to live, anyhow." "I'll move across the street to live, if you think you will find it more agreeable, and I shall in any case if you come home once more in the state that you were last night." "Oh, come, Helen, don't talk to a fellow that way. It was mean treatment, and I'm ashamed of it. I told you so at the time. I'm trying hard enough to keep away from the cursed temptation, but I need your help. I married you, Helen, because I loved you, and I need you. This is my time of trial. You needn't think I am not struggling, for I am. Will you help me?" A very pleading sound his voice had, but the world had gone awry with his wife that day. The dressmaker had failed in making a good fit, and so injured an elegant dress which couldn't be matched. So she answered the pleading voice still coldly. "I can only say that it is a very strange sort of love that exhibits itself in coming home in an idiotic, disgusting condition of mind and body. I would advise you not to repeat an experiment of that kind. It might be once too often." "Then I'll go and try it." He spoke angrily, all the gentleness, all the pleading gone out of his voice. And immediately he went out, banging the door after him. It might have been 2 hours afterward, it might have been longer. Mrs. Munroe never knew quite what time it was, that there was a sound of subdued voices in the hall, a kind of suppressed confusion. She stepped at once to the door and met Mr. Harper. Behind him were men and a burden. Mr. Harper pressed forward to intercept her step and words, but she had nursed herself into still greater rage during the intervening hours, and Mr. Harper's presence only served to anger her still more. "You need not bring him here," she said, losing all self-control. "As long as I am mistress of this house it shall not harbor drunken men. I warned him of the consequences. Carry him around the corner to his father's. Let him see the beautiful son he has brought up." Her eyes were blazing with excitement, and her whole manner was indicative of one who had lost all self-control. To Mr. Harper it was evident that prompt and decisive measures were necessary. His voice sounded almost stern in his effort at self-control. "Mrs. Munroe, you mistake. Your husband is dead." What a sudden, terrible sentence! She reeled, and would have fallen but for his supporting arm. He pushed open the parlor door and helped her in, motioning at the same time to the men to move forward with their burden. Once in the parlor, Mrs. Munroe neither screamed nor fainted. She looked frightened and shocked, but not, as Mr. Harper had expected, utterly overwhelmed. She sank down in the nearest chair and spoke quickly. "What do you mean? Is he really dead? What is the matter? What happened?" "It is quite hopeless," Mr. Harper said, averting his eyes that he might not intrude upon her grief. "He went into Harter's about an hour ago. Your brother said he was in a state of great excitement, had been drinking, and drank again. From there he went back to his own store, and Thompson, feeling alarmed about him, accompanied him. He acted strangely, put his hands to his head, said he guessed he had done it this time, and more too, referring, your brother thought, to some transaction that troubled him. Suddenly, in passing from the store to the office, he fell in what we thought was a fainting fit, but it proved to be congestion, caused by some unknown excitement, and and liquor. Mr. Harper judged it right to speak the whole truth even then. He added but a sentence. He breathed but a few times, and did not speak at all. Before a physician reached us, he was dead. "Dead!" Mrs. Munroe repeated, as if in bewilderment. "Why, that isn't possible. It is only a little while since he went out perfectly well, and I said— Oh, God forgive me! I wish I had said anything but that." Mr. Harper stood in silence, doubtful what next to do or say. Mrs. Munroe sat silent. If he could have looked at her thoughts, they would have read thus: "How dreadful it is! Then I am a widow, and I have been married so short a time. I wonder what I shall do. I suppose I shall have to go home. That's what I said to him. I wish I hadn't said that. I won't go home. I couldn't leave all my nice things and live in that wretched, poky old house again. I'm Mrs. Munroe, and I belong here. I shall stay, and have some one live with me. But how strange it will seem, and how dreadful! I'm young to be a widow. I shall have to put on black again, and I've had it off so short a time. Widows wear very deep mourning. Black is very becoming to me, but it is very sad to have to wear it." And this was all that Mrs. Munroe knew about being a widow. Do you think that Mr. Harper would have stood regarding her with such pitiful eyes if he could have read those thoughts? I tell you the pity would have been doubled, yea, trebled. To be a widow, when that word expresses all the unutterable, voiceless agony of a soul to whom life seems to have gone out in the blackness of darkness, is pitiful. But to be a widow, and to have the widowed heart know absolutely nothing of the blessed love that brightens all the past, and lights up the gloom of the future, that is bitterness indeed. But Mrs. Munroe did not know it. Perhaps this but increased the weight of pity that a strong, true heart would feel for her. She broke the silence suddenly, looking up at Mr. Harper as she spoke. "How strangely you are mixed up with my life!" It seemed such a strange thing to say at this time. It embarrassed him, he hardly knew why. "I was in the store at the time," he answered in a low, constrained voice. "Mrs. Munroe, what are your commands? What can I do first?" Actually, the worst part of this widow's trial was yet to come. It was revealed to her by Tom, who seemed to be her evil genius. She sat couched among the pillows of her lounge, a light shawl thrown around her, and occasionally she shivered, not from cold, but with excitement and pain. In the next room her husband lay in his coffin. "How do you know all this?" she said to Tom, suppressed excitement in her voice. "From excellent authority. Your respected father-in-law took the trouble to enlighten me." "And he said everything was gone?" "Everything belonging to Horace, and a great deal that belonged to his father. You know the business was left very much to Horace, and his father says that he has not been in a condition to attend to business for some time." "Thanks to you," she said with flashing eyes. "Horace was always running down to take a social glass with you." But that his heart was really pitiful for her, Tom could have laughed. The idea of him leading Horace Munroe astray! "Helen, that is pretty hard on a fellow," he said, half beseechingly. "I could tell you some solemn truths if it would do any good." "I don't want to hear your truths, nor anything else. I don't believe a word of all this. I'm not going to give up my house and go to live with them, and be ordered about by Mrs. Munroe. They needn't expect it." "They don't. That was part of my express direction to explain to you that the family were so situated it would be impossible to receive you there, and as it was equally impossible for you to stay here, your only alternative would be to go home." "And what am I to live on, I should like to know?" I ventured to make a similar inquiry, and he assured me he would do all he could for you, but it would become necessary for you, as well as for themselves, to practice the most rigid economy. If there were 2 words in the English language that Helen Munroe hated, they were those 2, rigid economy. "I don't believe a word of it," she said again, more sharply than before. "Why need you come here with your croaking? You might at least have waited until my husband was buried. He was so good to me. He was the only friend I ever had." Part of this sentence angered Tom, part of it touched him. His answer was prompted by a mixture of both feelings. "It was not a task I coveted, that of coming to you with my croaking. But Mr. Munroe foolishly enough imagined me to be the proper person to break the tidings to you, and he was particular enough in having it done before he met you. He said he considered it wiser for all parties. He is not much like our father, and, Helen, the trouble is heavy enough, but you have friends left and a home to go to." "Such a home as that is!" And Mrs. Munroe's lip curled scornfully. "There is a great contrast between that home and this one. I wonder if you think I can ever be content to come down to that sort of life again?" "It is better than nothing," Tom said, vexed again. "I should prefer it to starvation, and I shouldn't wonder if you would be prevailed upon to take up with it." Mrs. Munroe turned her head wearily toward the wall. "I shall have to take up with anything or nothing," she said in a heavy, dreary tone. "I have lost my friend, my one friend." And then Tom's heart ached for her again. He had a great longing to comfort her. "There are other things beside this life," he began awkwardly. "Other hopes and friendships, I suppose. I should think they might be a comfort at such a time." His sister moved restlessly on her couch. "Don't talk of what you know nothing about," she said impatiently. "I don't believe in that sort of talk, anyway." "What sort do you believe in?" he asked coolly, his sympathy fast oozing away. "No sort that comes from you. I wish you would go home." "I'm going. I'm glad I have been able to see how beautifully religion sustains and upholds people in time of trial. I've heard considerable about it, but I never realized it as forcibly as I do now." And Tom Randolph actually went down the stairs whistling. Maria appeared to him from one of the rooms below, looking reproving volumes. "It's not quite the thing, I admit," he said in answer to her look, "but a fellow sometimes whistles when, but for education and principle and all that, he might swear. Maria, Helen has got to come home to live. Now you whistle if you can." "Home?" Maria said, in undisguised dismay. "What for?" "The Munroe property has gone up, Horace's part of it anyway, and old Munroe says the whole is going. That is all moonshine, though, but they don't feel any too comfortable toward her. They think it is her fault that he went to the mischief so fast." "Oh, Tom, you didn't tell Helen they said so?" "It's not very likely, though I'll admit that I was horribly tempted." "Tom, what in the world shall we do?" Maria said, going back to the astounding and painful revelation. "I thought she would live on here, and perhaps take Grace to live with her. Grace is the only one of us who can't possibly earn her own living. If worse comes to worse, I could hoe potatoes, but what Grace could do puzzles me. And now that planning is over with. What shall we do?" "Whistle," said Tom philosophically. "That is all there is left to do. She's got to come, anyhow. Don't you feel the force of the elevating and consolatory influences of religion that they tell about? I realize it more and more." "There's faith," Maria said thoughtfully. "Bah! Life goes as smooth with her as with a summer day. What has she to be consoled about?" "But she has lost all her friends, you know. No one left but Pearlie." "Yes, and she had hysterics every day for a month, I presume. They are just the sort to get over it quickly." "Well, there's father." "Yes," he said, "there's father. That's true. It's a puzzling world." All the proprieties were observed in Mr. Munroe's funeral. No one certainly would have imagined that the firm were on the eve of failure, from the amount of money lavished on the quiet, senseless clay and its belongings. His widow was shrouded in bombazine and crape of the finest texture, and everything was becomingly solemn and somber. Ermina stood on the doorstep, waiting her turn to enter the carriage. There was some delay. Their father had been the one on whom the widow was to depend for support, but his strength at the last moment had proved too slight for the occasion. Mr. Randolph was fast dropping into invalidism, and Tom had been summoned hurriedly from Ermina's side to attend his eldest sister. During the delay occasioned by the change of program, Mr. Harper came from the hall and stood for a moment beside Ermina. Instantly she remembered what his last words had been to her. How little either had imagined where they might meet. She wondered if he remembered it. Even as she wondered, he bent slightly toward her, and spoke low. " Is the decision made? "" It is," she said firmly. " It is body and soul this time." Chapter 24 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. Chapter 24 Theology in the Kitchen. Ermina Randolph curled herself into as much of a heap as she could, and placed a cushion for her head. It was Ermina's nature to make herself comfortable, if the thing were possible. She was in Faith's room, making her and baby a little visit. It was one of those cool evenings when grown-up people consider it their duty to shiver around the house with little shawls over their shoulders, and feel it a positive luxury to have a baby in the house to furnish an excuse for making up a cheery blaze of fire. Pearlie, on the floor, was cooing over the firelight shadows, and Faith sat very near the stove to shield the grasping hands from snatching at the brightness. " Doesn't it go right? " she said, in answer to Ermina's long-drawn sigh. " Not very," Ermina said, ending the sigh with a little laugh. " Things look mixed, and life seems bewildering." " It has its bewildering side, I'll admit," Faith said. " But, after all, that is generally because we want to admire the design before it is finished. What is the superlative of your troubles ?"" Why," Ermina said, laughing, " it has none, I guess. That is one of my troubles. A real, definite, tangible superlative would be encouraging. But pin pricks and mosquito bites seem so insignificant in themselves, yet, after all, no one enjoys being pricked or bitten." " Considering myself the pin that does the pricking, who or what is the mosquito ?"" You a pin !"" I fancy you might prick, though, if you really wanted to. I don't think you are one of the softly people. But Helen, now, is a real mosquito. Did you really ever see any one who had more talent than she has for making herself miserable ?"" I should think it would require a great deal of grace to endure some things." " Which is what I haven't," Ermina said, gravely and sadly. " My trouble has a superlative, after all. I'm just a baby in the Christian life, just groping and feeling my way, when I might be walking firmly on high ground. I've wasted years and years." " I know. The thought is a sad one, and a solemn one. Yet I think perhaps Paul meant that, too, when he said, ' Forgetting the things that are behind.' I suppose he made failures, but he thought that Christ's blood was powerful enough to atone for even failures, and his love strong enough to forgive them. I don't imagine that Paul kept looking back and sighing over them after Christ had forgiven them. Do you ?"" I suppose not. Yet, after all, it doesn't seem quite the thing to do — I mean for me. I suppose it was all right enough in Paul, it was, of course, for he was inspired. But for me, I don't know but past shortcomings ought to be kept before me to keep me humble." " But not to hinder you," Faith said, quickly. " When Satan begins to use past shortcomings as a chain by which to fetter our thoughts to ourselves, then it is time to forget them. Do you think Paul's inspiration was only for himself? I think God looked ahead and said, ' There are Faith Halsted and Ermina Randolph. They will need the same kind of warning or explanation or comfort that Paul does. I will have it written out for them." Ermina sat erect, letting the cushions drop heedlessly to the floor. " Does the Bible seem like that to you ?" she said, with eager eyes. " I wish it did for me — I mean, to make it read so — actually written for me. It is pleasant, but very queer." " I don't see why," Faith said, stoutly. " Of course it was written for you. Why, the very hairs of your head are numbered, the least little event in life planned for your good. Is that any less wonderful than that God thought of your needs when he directed certain words to be handed down to you?" Ermina looked thoughtfully at her cousin, and spoke absently. "Your Bible is like Mr. Harper's." "I dare say, and like yours and Helen's and every one's, if only we will not try to make it read Hebrew when it wants to read plain English. Is there anything unusual about his Bible?" "Only that, as you say, it seems to read for him, and not for Paul and Peter only. He has strange ideas. He was speaking of his friends in heaven, and I ventured to ask him a question that has puzzled me ever so much, as to how a husband, for instance, could be entirely blissfully happy in heaven, while his wife was waiting in loneliness and weariness on earth." "What did he say?" Faith asked, speaking in lower tones and shading her eyes with her hand, for here was her weak spot in the chain. This seemed hard to her, who had all her friends in heaven and missed them sorely and sadly. "He said I had forgotten the force of that one word, eternity; that we measured time by comparison. If my friend were to spend a month with me, an hour given to some one else would seem a very trifle. The nearest and dearest friends you know can be separated for several months, and while they of course miss each other, they can still enjoy the life around them and be happy in the thought of the coming together. He spoke of that. He told me of his sister going to Europe, of how she missed him, yet of how much she enjoyed her journey, and what delightful letters she wrote him concerning it. Then he said his mother had been 20 years in heaven, but he thought that eternity was so long, in comparison with 20 years, that the years dwindled into hours, and that she, looking forward over perhaps 20 years more of separation, said, 'Only a day or two more, and my son will come.'" "I see," Faith said, still with shaded eyes, and a voice a little husky. "A year is only a half hour in heaven. I had not thought of it in just that light." Ermina rose up from her cushions. "Well," she said, "I've had my crumb of help and comfort. I'll go now to my sewing. I brought Mrs. Elwood's dress home to baste 11 ruffles on the front breadth." "I got my crumb, too," Faith said, looking up brightly. "So you see we had an exchange of loaves." Maria was the next caller. She sat on the floor, squarely before the fire. Maria never took the time to put herself into places of great comfort. "What a solemn face!" Faith said, gaily. "Was the cake heavy?" "No, but the biscuit was sour." "Why, I didn't discover it." "They were, just a trifle, but enough to evince their relationship to this totally depraved world. I wonder that any one has difficulty in accepting the doctrine of total depravity. Housekeepers certainly ought to believe in it. The way apple sauce works, and bread molds, and milk sours, and butter grows strong, is bewildering and distracting, to say nothing of the way in which the ants march into the sugar, and wretched big and little flies pounce upon and devour everything they can touch their feet to, and dust and cobwebs poke themselves in everywhere. I'm sick of the world." Faith's laugh rang out merrily. "What a solemn procession of troubles! That is kitchen depravity, I think. Flies and bugs and cobwebs and mold, but no humanity." "Humanity! Plenty of it. There is evidence enough of humanity in Helen to convince me that we all belong to that miserable old Eve who had to please herself, whatever the consequences. I hope I shan't have to be on friendly terms with her, for I know I should twit her about that apple, if it was an apple. It is quite as likely to have been a lemon for all I know to the contrary. Things and people everywhere seem awry, and that is the whole of it. I can't help thinking I could have made a better world myself." "That isn't the whole of it, and that is just where you and I make mistakes. It is only a little tiny corner, and the rest of it we can't see at all. Take care, Pearlie! No, Pearlie mustn't touch. You can see how wise he thinks he is. The blaze of the fire is beautiful, and he is determined to have it in his hand. He thinks I am a cruel old ogre, keeping him from happiness. I have tried all the evening to convince him that I knew more about it than he did, and I have been wondering whether I shouldn't have to let him burn his poor precious little hand, just a tiny bit, to convince him that there is danger there." "I see the application in part," Maria said, gloomily. "Only I was talking about flies and bugs, not a sign of a bright blaze do I see." "And I was talking of the ignorance of both of you," Faith answered, merrily. "You neither of you see but an inch ahead, and you think you see and know all about it. You both think you could manage things better for yourself if you could be let alone." "What do you suppose is to become of Tom?" Maria asked the question in the same half petulant, half gloomy tone in which she had all the time been talking. The transition evidently did not seem so striking to her as it did to Faith. "Do you really suppose he is going to be a drunkard? He is pretty nearly that now by spells, but I mean, do you actually think he is going to sink down to that hopelessly?" Faith's face grew grave, and her voice was serious. "No," she said firmly, "I don't. I can't think any such thing. I believe he is to be rescued." "How?" "I don't know. God knows, and I have no doubt he is preparing the way. Maria, I don't know but he sees that he will have to let Tom burn his hand." Maria looked up quickly. "You mean some heavy pain. Through whom could it come? Through father?" And she shivered. "I don't want that. It seems to me that God might make him learn some other way." "I can't make Pearlie learn," Faith said gently. "I have to sit between him and the fire, and I can't always do that. Sometimes I shall have to be moving about the room. It will be necessary for him to learn that there is danger." "But, Faith, you are not God. He surely has ways." "I think so, and warning of danger is one of his ways." "Horace's death might have served for the warning, one would think. It was sudden and sad enough. But then Tom doesn't attribute that so much to liquor as he does to Helen. Well, I don't know how it will end, but it does seem hard that when father has but one son, he must be a terror and a misery to him instead of a comfort." They sat in silence for a little, except for the soft cooing between Faith and Pearlie as she changed his white robe for his "sleepy dress," and cuddled the loving little head on her shoulder. When his night lullaby had been sung, and she had laid him among the pillows, she came back to the girl sitting bolt upright, with folded arms, staring into the firelight. "I should think you would want to pray for him," she said, slipping down beside her. "What's the use?" Maria answered, coldly. "I never could see that praying did any good. Father has been praying for him ever since he was born. I hear him sometimes at night. You and I couldn't resist such prayers, but God can. What does it all amount to?" "I don't know, nor do you," Faith said, speaking almost sternly. "And if I were you, I wouldn't dare to estimate what he might have been without those prayers." "But what are you going to do about the answer? I tell you, he prays half the night sometimes for Tom's conversion, whatever that may mean. Anyway, it means something that he isn't. What can you say to that?" "Why, there is plenty to say. In the first place, Tom is still living. There is no proof that God doesn't intend to answer that prayer. And there will not be until he dies unconverted." "Why doesn't he answer it, then?" "I don't know. Suppose you ask him." In spite of the daring way in which she had herself been talking, Maria looked a little startled over this sentence. "I'm sure I don't see why you shouldn't," Faith said. "You like consistency, and you are quick to detect inconsistencies in other people. Does it never occur to you as strange that one who professes so great interest in Tom and anxiety for him should never make any attempt to interest the Saviour in his behalf? It might do good, you know, and you must be certain that it could do no harm." "There wouldn't be much faith about that kind of praying, I should think. I thought faith was an important item in prayer." "There would be as much faith as you seem to possess, and it is possible that the attempt at prayer might increase your faith." "I don't see how praying can do any good, and never did see. When things are prearranged for ages, what difference does it make whether I pray or not? How can it make any difference?" I don't know, but my idea of God is that he is wiser than I am. I presume he knows, indeed I may say I am sure of it, else he never would have made prayer not only a privilege, but a duty." "Well, but, Faith, are people called upon to believe absurdities? Take Tom, for instance. If God knows anything, he knows that Tom will either be a drunkard or he will not be, and whichever way his knowledge reaches, settles the question. Now what difference will it make whether I pray for him or not?" "Why don't you reason in that way about other matters?" "I do. I think in just that way about 1,000 things. They will be, or they will not be, in spite of me, and I might as well sit down and await their development." "Then why don't you? If there is to be bread made in this house to-morrow, there will be, whether I set the sponge to-night or not, so I will just sit down and await its development." "Because," said Maria, laughing a little, "there wouldn't be. Not a loaf of bread made in this house from one year's end to another, if I didn't do it." "Not if it were determined upon ages ago?" "Well," and then she picked up a stick and poked at the coals, "it doesn't seem the same when we talk about our bread-making and our sweeping." "I know it doesn't, and it is just here that we make our greatest blunders, I think. We invest everything pertaining to religion in a hopeless kind of mist, and then we sneer at it because it cannot be judged according to the rules of common sense." "Well, just tell me how you explain any of it. The bread-making, too, if you will. If it is really ordered that I am to make bread to-morrow, why, I shall make it, whether I want to or not, or rather, whether I set myself about it or not." Faith laughed. "You may judge for yourself whether that sounds like your favorite word, common sense," she said pleasantly. "But I understand your meaning. I don't pretend to explain it. If it were 10 times more enveloped with mystery than it is, I should still believe it all, for God my Father has put his seal to it. But when I want to speculate, I find no difficulty in thinking that he could have foreseen, and therefore predestinated, if you will, your ability and your willingness to make bread for us, and that your reason and your common sense should show you the need for doing so." "Then why should not my reason and common sense force me into doing other things that I ought to?" "I'm sure I don't know," Faith answered, gravely. "It is a question over which I have often puzzled." Maria laughed, a slightly constrained laugh. Her common sense showed her plainly that she had shut herself into a very narrow corner. She arose suddenly from her low seat. "You may not think it," she said, speaking earnestly, "but I am very anxious about Tom, more anxious than I can tell you. If I knew how to do anything earthly or unearthly to help him, I would. The great trouble is, I don't know how. I'm sure I hope, if anything is to be done for him, it will be done promptly. I don't see what it will be, though. Meantime, I'll go and set that sponge. I know how to do that, at least." And that which was to touch Tom was coming swiftly all the time. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. God's Mystery of Grace. He was tucked into the carriage, his blue wrap thrown loosely about him, for the morning was cool. His blue afghan covered his feet, a blue plume nodded in his white hat, and he looked a very prince among his subjects, for they all came out to see him off, Maria with her broom at her side, Grace bringing the knife with which she was peeling apples, even Helen left her sewing and came out to say good-bye to the baby. "Isn't he lovely this morning?" Grace said, kissing him energetically. "Where are you going, Faith?" "We are going to rove according to our own wild wills. Where we will go is all unknown to me, and when or how we will return is equally involved in mystery. I hope I shall have my sweeping done before you are moved to come back. Don't get sleepy, Prince Pearly, until the house is in order." "Wish us joy and good speed," Faith said, merrily. "Perhaps something to remember all our lives will happen to us before we return." "There are two kinds of things to remember," Helen said grimly, and Faith had to carry those away with her for last words. Down the sunny side of the street, trundling along in a flutter of life and joy, went Pearlie. Not a bird escaped his notice, not a leaf rustled that he did not hear. Faith, pushing her lovely, canopied carriage before her, chattering in sweet baby fashion to her darling, felt not less happy than he. A still happiness, such as those feel who have given up many of their treasures to the Saviour's keeping, and have grace left to be unutterably thankful for some darling still left in their care. As they turned the corner of Vesey Street, and trundled along on the smooth flagging, Faith suddenly paused. Should she go down Vesey Street? Splendid as the flagging was, it was a street of many children and much whooping cough. She turned her carriage and retraced her steps. She would go back and go down the further end of their own street. That was smooth and broad and pleasant. As they walked, Tom Randolph came, with rather unsteady steps, towards them. Tom's step was getting to be unsteady, even in the early morning. It took but little poison to fire his excitable brain. Pearlie held up a smooth stone in one hand and a stick in the other, and greeted him with a chuckle of delight. Long before this Tom had given over his dislike for babyhood and surrendered completely to the charms of his little Pearl. So now he stopped for the usual frolic, but his breath was odorous with liquor, and his talk rapid and excited. "What a stupid old ride that auntie of yours is taking, Prince Pearlie, creeping along at snail pace when he ought to be running, rushing, flying in this wild morning. Here, give me the helm. I'll give him such a ride as he seldom gets." "Not too fast," Faith said anxiously, as he courteously but peremptorily possessed himself of the carriage. No one could be gentler than Tom Randolph when he was himself, but she distrusted him in these excited moods, and yet she did not like to refuse him, so she repeated her gentle caution. "Not too fast, please. Oh, Tom, do be careful. He isn't used to it. You will frighten him." "He acts like it. Hear him laugh. Never fear for him. He's a man, and not so easily frightened as the ladies are. Here we go. Up, up!" And he swung the carriage suddenly around the corner, one wheel on the stone, the other in the gully below. Faith shrieked a little. "Tom, oh, Tom, don't! Let me have him. Wait for me." "No waiting for laggards. This is the Lightning Express. Here we go!" And at that instant the carriage struck violently against a projecting stone and overturned. Pearlie, thrown forward by the suddenness of the jolt, fell out, striking his head on the pavement. In an instant Faith had him in her arms, and Tom, beside her, spoke in a hurried but thoroughly sobered tone. "He is not hurt. I am sure he isn't. The fright has made him faint. Please let me take him. I will run home with him and have a doctor in 3 minutes." "Don't touch him," Faith said in a low, stern voice. Then she went with swift steps down the street, bearing her still burden into the pretty yard which she had so lately left. Maria was there sweeping the piazza. "Hi!" she said gaily. "What is the matter with Prince Pearlie? Did he rebel at his carriage? Why, Faith, is he hurt?" This last in an altered tone, seeing Faith's face. Then she went swiftly in, not waiting for an answer, opened the door of Faith's room, and brought his own little pillow. How swiftly and silently they worked, bathing the poor blue-veined temple where the stone had struck, holding a cloth wet in ammonia to his nose, rubbing the tiny feet and limbs. Almost immediately the doctor had arrived, for Tom had gone with swift steps to his call. He made very few suggestions, and what he did seemed almost mechanical. Gradually the eagerness of their efforts slackened, and one and another of them looked with frightened, appealing faces at the doctor, looks which he studiously avoided answering. Finally they stood back, all but Faith, and looked at the beautiful little face, white and still. There had been no quiver of the eyelids, no motion of the little hand, from the very first. As for Faith, she did not even glance at any of them, but went steadily, silently on, rubbing the cold limbs, bathing the blue temple, until suddenly she dropped the cloth from her hand, and gathering her baby in her arms, while she showered hot, burning kisses on his white lips, sank down on her knees. Then they went swiftly and quietly out, leaving her alone with her terrible sorrow. "Isn't there a shadow of hope?" Grace asked, piteously, catching the doctor's hand in her eagerness. "He must have died instantly. Evidently he struck his temple violently, and it produced immediate death." The doctor's voice trembled. He had stood that very morning, shading his eyes from the sun, and watching that triumphal little chariot. He knew what a treasure it contained. "How did it happen? Who knows anything about it?" Maria questioned eagerly. "I know all about it." And Tom's voice was so hard it startled her even then. "I ought to know. I killed him. Now you have the whole story. Enjoy it." "Tom, oh, Tom!" Grace cried, piteously. "Don't speak so. Don't look so. What can you mean?" "I mean just that. I killed him. I had been drinking, and I didn't know what I was about." Every one but Helen saw that Tom's excitement was so intense that he hardly knew what he was saying, but she exclaimed in horror, "And you care as little about it as that! Tom Randolph, I don't know what you can be made of. If I were Faith, I could never endure to look at you again. I should think—" He interrupted her in a voice which startled even her. "Helen, stop! You are the last one on earth to reproach me. I have not your sin on my conscience even yet. The baby was ready to go, and that cannot be said of every one." And then Tom dashed away from them out of the house, down the street, like a madman. The intensity of his excitement had been apparent in his words. It was the first time since Helen's homecoming that he had given her reason to think that he knew one cause of her husband's death lay at her own door. You could not have found a more beautiful picture than the baby maid lying in his white casket, with flowers of every hue and shape scattered with lavish hand about him, not white flowers only, but brilliant red and yellow blossoms. "He loved them," said Maria, in answer to Helen's protest that colored flowers were in bad taste at a funeral. "He loved the brightest ones best. Why shouldn't I put them around him?" Faith had dressed him herself, in his fairest and daintiest white dress, and buttoned the kid slippers about his ankle, and combed the rings of golden hair about her finger, just as she was wont to do, and said, through blinding tears, "He is going to find his papa and mamma. I have made him beautiful, just as mamma would like to see him, and told him good-bye." Faith, from first to last, had astonished the Randolph family. None had known better than they how entirely the love and devotion of her life had centered in the beautiful baby, the only one left to her bearing the family name. They had expected her to lie crushed and helpless and hopeless at the foot of that little coffin. But in less than an hour she had come out from that closed room, saying, with a faint smile, "Mamma wanted him very much. She said she could not go and leave him. She has him now." And then she had taken up the work of life again, or perhaps I might better say the enduring of life. Her work had been to dress Pearly in the morning, to watch his footsteps as they tottered from one mischief to another, to hush him for his morning nap, to prepare his simple dinner, to take him on his many rides and walks, to dress him in long, loose night robes, to watch over him at night, to dress him again in the morning. Her work was gone. Happy for those who can feel that duties many and important are pressing upon them, and that they have no time to sit down to grief. During the 2 days that had intervened since death had come among them, Tom had not been seen at home. His meals, if he had any, were taken elsewhere. They had feared that he was trying to find relief from his remorse in liquor, but a chance word with Mr. Harper revealed that he had not drunk a drop since the dreadful morning. It was the day for the funeral. At 4 o'clock, Faith's darling was to be put away from her. She had spent the morning in the closed room where he lay sleeping. It was nearly noon when she came out to Maria and said, "Where is Tom?" "I wish any of us knew," Maria answered sadly. "I have not seen him since— none of us have. I don't know what he is doing, nor what he means to do." "Has any one been here to offer help of any kind?" "Nearly every one. People are coming all the time. Mr. Harper calls every morning. He passed a few moments ago. I presume he will stop when he returns." "If he does, will you tell him from me that I want him to find Tom, and ask him to come home right away? I want to see him." "Oh, Faith, I wouldn't try to do that. It will be too hard." "Nothing that is left to my life can be very hard," Faith said with a quiet smile. "Be sure to tell him." In accordance with this message, repeated with earnest persistence by Mr. Harper, Tom came just after dinner. What a young man with a nature like Tom Randolph's had suffered, during the 2 days past, can hardly be imagined, much less described. Sensitive and sympathetic to an unusual degree, loving little Pearlie with an affection not often bestowed by a young man upon a baby, feeling, oh, how keenly, that the precious little life was lost through gross and inexcusable carelessness on his part, knowing that the story, with many enlargements and additions, was in everybody's mouth, he had felt at times as if life was not to be endured for another hour, as if he must put an end to it all. Prominent among his terrors had been the thought of meeting Faith again. Helen's words, almost unconsciously to himself, hovered around him in various forms. How could she endure ever to see his face again? How could he best dispose of himself so as to wound her in the least? These were questions which haunted him. Feeling thus, it had seemed at first an impossibility to obey her summons, and but for Mr. Harper's persistence it would not have been obeyed. Faith was in that closed room when Grace tapped gently at the door and whispered, "Tom is here." Faith went forward and opened the door. "Will you ask him to come to me here?" she said quietly, and Tom came. She was startled at the change 2 days had wrought. There were heavy dark rings under his sunken eyes, and his mouth was set firmly, as one in actual bodily pain. Faith came over to him as he stood at the closed door, and laid her hand gently on his arm. "Poor Tom," she said, speaking softly. "Poor Tom, I wish I could tell you how very, very sorry I am for you. Your trouble is heavier than mine, but I wanted to see you while my darling lay here. I wanted you to see how very sweet he looks, and I wanted to tell you that I do not feel hard to you, not any at all. I know you would not intentionally have hurt one hair of his precious head. I want you to forgive yourself, Tom, as entirely as I forgive you." For a moment Tom stood, with folded arms, and that set look about his mouth. Then he strode forward to the side of that little coffin, and, kneeling there, bowed his head and wept out his agony. Such tears as only men shed who are very rarely moved to tears. Groan after groan escaped him, shaking the tiny casket against which he leaned, while Faith stood aside and looked on in awe at a grief the bitterness of which she had never realized. After a little he spoke, but his voice was the voice of prayer. "O God," he said, and there was solemn, intense meaning in his voice, "O God of mercy and of forgiveness, grant to me that spirit so divine, so like thine, that it can forgive even such a sin as mine has been. For the first time in my life I realize what the Christian spirit is. I want to be a Christian. I will be one. Give me thy pardon, even as one who follows close after thee has done. That she can forgive me, can endure to look upon me, emboldens me to believe that thy mercy is great enough even for me. God be merciful to me, a sinner. Help me for Christ's sake. An hour ago I was eager to die, now I am ready to live. There are things that I can never undo, but I beg for Christ in my heart, shining forth in my life. I have seen it today as never before. God of love, take my poor sinful soul into thy keeping." Amen, said Faith's low, gentle voice. Saviour, I thank thee that here at my darling's coffin has blossomed so precious a flower, the new life of a soul. Even my blessed baby was not too much to give for this. My Father, I thank thee that thou hast given me so sweet a balm in this sad hour. There had come a strange change over Tom Randolph's face during this little time. Grave it was, and deeply sad, yet the sorrow was not despair, and the gravity was not desperation. "Tom, will you come this afternoon?" This was what Faith said to him as they arose. "Can you bear to have me?" he asked her piteously. "Not only that, but I want you to be here." Then he went for the first time and looked at the sweet little face that had grown so dear to him, and that was so full of calm and beauty. "It is a heavy, heavy price to pay," he said tremulously. "My poor soul was not worth it, but I had well nigh lost it. I think I was very near the end." "Your soul, remember, was worth the death of the Son of God," she said solemnly. "See that you make your life worthy such a sacrifice as that." Great was the astonishment of the Randolph family, and indeed of the friends who knew the sad story, when Faith followed her darling to his resting place, attended by her cousin Tom. "It could not have been true," said the lookers-on. "That story we heard must have been nothing but a story. Tom Randolph is with her, and she does not shrink from him at all." "Faith hasn't the spirit of a mouse," so said her cousin, Helen Munroe. "One would think she would have banished Tom to-day, for appearance sake, if for nothing else." "She is incomprehensible to me," said Maria to Grace. "I can't understand how one who is so intense in her feelings as she is can control herself so as to be patient with Tom." "She is a rare Christian," said Mr. Harper to Ermina, and the latter assented with a little sigh. It was so very far beyond what she felt that she could have done. "She has proved the truth of the religion of Jesus Christ as I never felt it before. God bless her. God bless and comfort and keep her." So said Tom Randolph, in the silence and loneliness of his own room, just as he bowed himself to consecrate to Jesus Christ his life, body, and soul from henceforth. Who shall say that the sweet baby, so early gone home to heaven, lived his little life in vain? End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Laces and Duty. Tom Randolph sat in the dining room with his chair tipped back, his hat drawn over his eyes, and his feet on the rounds of another chair. Contrary to Mrs. Munroe's code of morals, Tom's new start in life had not yet made him a careful observer of all the rules of propriety. The less religion does for a person's own life and habits, the more certain is that person to expect it to work a sudden and complete transformation in the habits of one who has very recently professed to be governed by its precepts. Tom was deep in thought, which, to judge by the expression on his face, was not very pleasant. Mrs. Munroe was plaiting a crepe ruffle, and Maria was setting the table for the next morning's breakfast. The household had narrowed down. The summer and early autumn had gone from them, so also had Faith. Contrary to the opinions of some good people, she held it to be her privilege to make life as endurable as she could, and to stay among the rooms that had echoed to the constant patter of Pearlie's little feet made the weight of pain seem heavier, so she went away. Maria, as she set the table, sighed a little as she left vacant the end where Faith and Pearlie used to sit. Maria missed them sadly. Tom looked up at last, pushed his hat back a little, and smiled faintly. Very few smiles had Tom Randolph to bestow. One may rally from a heavy sorrow which God has sent, and smile brightly even between the tears. But a weight of self-remorse over a sin that has brought lifelong sorrow to someone, a sorrow that but for you might not be, Such pain to a young man like Tom Randolph cuts deeply and leaves little heart for smiling. "I'm a gentleman of leisure," he said to Maria, and she gave a little start of dismay at the news. You must forgive Maria. She did not want her brother to sell liquor for a living, but she kept the family purse, and Tom paid his board. "Couldn't you wait a little?" she said, deprecatingly. "I didn't see how I could, Maria. I couldn't sell any more liquor." "I'm sure I don't see why," Helen said, sharply. "You have sold it for some months, and I should think a few days longer would make very little difference. It would be an improvement on coming home to father to be supported." Now this was precisely what Helen herself had done. One wouldn't have supposed that she would have condemned it in another. Tom controlled the impulse to tell her so, and answered simply, "I felt that I could not sell another drop of liquor." "Well," Maria said, with a long-drawn sigh, "I suppose you are right, and I shall be glad enough that you are out of it when you get in somewhere else, but the week's accounts won't match very well now." "I know," he said with a gloomy face. "The burden rests heavily. I'm afraid it will be some time before I can find employment. I've met with nothing but failures today." "Of course," Helen said, with a volume of significance in her tones. "You can't expect people to trust you." Tom's boots came down from the chair so suddenly that Helen said, with a nervous start, "Dear me, how rough you are!" But he said not a word. The outside door creaked slowly, and Mr. Randolph came in with weary step. Helen gave him the easy chair in which she had been sitting, and Maria brought his slippers. "How tired you look," she said, anxiously. "And you are late tonight, too. I think it is too bad that you have to do overwork." "Not often," he said feebly, and then he coughed sharply. "Father," said Tom, with the air of one who had something to communicate that was depressing, and the sooner it could be told and put away, the better. "I wish you needed an errand boy or porter, or something of that sort, at your store. I've thrown up my work and am an object of charity." Mr. Randolph put his tired hands on the armchair and drew himself up, and came with eager steps toward his son. "Thank God," he said, with trembling earnestness. "I thank him that this trouble is ended. I have felt it bitterly. I am a temperance man, you know, my son." Tom Randolph arose and stood beside his father. He towered above him. He rested one hand on his arm, and his voice trembled more than his father's had. "Father, I am a temperance man, too. I have signed a total abstinence pledge today. I hope to atone in a measure for the pain I have given you." "I'm sure I am very glad," Helen said, when both father and son had left the room. "As glad as any one can be. Only one can't help wishing that his repentance had come a little earlier." Maria slammed the closet door. "If you ever get to heaven," she said irritably, "you will say, 'I can't help wishing I had come yesterday or waited until tomorrow.' Things as they are never quite right in your estimation." Helen opened her eyes in wonder. "Dear me," she said plaintively, "what have I said now? I seem to be always saying something." "That's true," Maria murmured, and she banged the other closet door a little before she left the room. Tom came in search of her while she was in the pantry setting the cakes for breakfast. "Father was pleased with my leaving the saloon," he said, speaking a little wistfully. She turned toward him a bright face. "Of course he was," she said, heartily. "So am I. Only the world, the flesh, and the other one got the better of me for a little." "It is gloomy work for you, I know," he said sadly. "It seems almost hopeless for me to try to get employment. At the best, there is very little doing, and my former experience and reputation are not flattering. If I were only a girl, I would have a chance to try at least." "A girl? Why, I thought it was more difficult for a girl to get work than a boy." "I suppose it is, generally speaking. But I know of a chance for a girl. Arthur and McAllister advertise for a clerk. I answered the advertisement this morning, but they informed me that they employed none but females at the lace counter." This conversation sent Maria to bed with wide-open eyes, that continued open far into the midnight. The result of which midnight musing was a conversation with Grace over the next morning's breakfast dishes. The conversation opened with her favorite expression. "There's no use in talking, Grace. Something has got to be done." "I know it," Grace said, meekly. There had been so much talking that she knew quite well what Maria meant, without explanation. That young lady, however, proceeded to explain. "Here's Helen on our hands to support, and Tom without anything to do, and father looking paler and coughing harder every night. It's time there was a chance." "Can you think of anything?" "Yes, 100 things. It is easier to think than to do. However, I'm going to try doing. Tom says there is a vacancy at Arthur and McAllister's, and I'm going this very morning to try for it. If I succeed, you'll have to keep house. You'll hate it, I know, but so do I hate lace. That's where the vacancy is, at the lace counter. If you can conceive of anything more stupid than puttering over boxes of lace from morning till night, I don't know what it can be. I'd rather bake griddle cakes or wash dishes, and I've no particular love for that employment either. However, tastes and feelings and things of that sort have all been ground up long ago in this house and eaten for daily bread." "I don't see how the house is ever going to get along without you," Grace said, dismay in her voice, in her eyes, all about her. "It is to get along with you the best way it can. I'm sure you can get us all something to eat if you try. Anyway, I can't much longer, without some money to get it with, and I know no other way but to go and earn some." There was one other way. Grace timidly suggested it. "If Helen would only apply for the vacant place." "Helen!" echoed Maria, in undisguised disdain. "I think I see her doing it. Why, bless your heart, child, don't you know it isn't genteel to sell lace? It is perfectly proper to live on a sick father. In fact, it is quite genteel to starve, if you do it gracefully. But the idea of one who has been connected with the Munroe family stooping to lace selling isn't to be thought of for a moment." I may as well say, just here, that no sooner were the dishes dried and marshaled into place than Maria put her plans into execution, and the firm of Arthur and McAllister being really in need, and being well acquainted with her father, she met with prompt success. Then commenced a series of martyrdom such as the Randolph family had hitherto not known. Such breakfasts as were shrinkingly brought before the miserable victims. Such dinners as they endured. Grace worked from dawn till dark and did her very best, but she really had no more affinity for cooking than a canary bird, and whatever other branches of business may be carried on successfully without a fair knowledge of and general interest in the details, housekeeping cannot. So the steak was burned or smoked, and the bread was sticky and sour, the pies were exasperating, and poor Grace came regularly to the table with cheeks aglow and 3 fingers done up in rags, burned or cut as the case might be. Maria's disgust sent her daily to the lace counter with a frowning face. She was sharp to the customers, and positively crabbed to sister clerks to such a degree that she more than once received a hint from headquarters that she must be more civil or lose her place. Despite all these grievances, the week's salary from the lace counter helped considerably in the family puzzle. So each girl stood her ground with the resolution that helps to make martyrs, though Grace retreated nightly under the bedclothes with red eyelids. One evening Maria plodded home from the store, through mud and rain, without either rubbers or umbrella (waterproof she had not), and the consequence was sneezes and involuntary weeping out of one eye the next day. "There is no use in trying to thumb over lace to-day," she said to Grace, who was looking gravely at the greasy spider. "You'll just have to go in my place." "What, to the store?" Grace said, dropping the spider in her surprise. "Yes, of course. I believe you have cracked that. What is the use of being so careless? My head spins round like a top, and feels as large as the flour barrel, and as empty. Tell Mr. McAllister, with my compliments, that he won't have the pleasure of growling at me to-day." "But what will you do about the work?" "Why, I'll do it. Because I can't walk a mile in the rain, it doesn't follow that I can't do a little work in the kitchen. And I'll have a decent dinner once more, I venture to say." This last in an undertone. Then louder, "Will you try the store?" "Why, of course I'll try. But, Maria, I'm not sure that I shall succeed any better than I do at cooking." Maria tied a handkerchief around her aching head and mopped the kitchen floor. Grace rarely had time for mopping. Then she made some apple sauce for dinner that stayed in delightful quarters, a thing which Grace's apple sauce was never known to do. The dinner, though it was only baked potatoes and cold meat, was a success. For, be it known, there is a way to make utterly uneatable even baked potatoes and cold meat, and poor Grace knew that way. Then when at tea-time Maria had sufficiently subdued eyes and nose, so that she gave herself up to the pleasure of making a delicious creamy johnny cake, the comfort of the Randolph family reached a height unknown for weeks. As for Grace, the day passed quietly. The lace was neither greasy nor sticky, two things which she abhorred. The rain prevented much sale, but in the arrangement of the boxes she proved useful, saying, after but a lesson or two, "I can tell the real from the imitation now, I think." "How do you tell?" Mr. McAllister asked her, looking her through with keen eyes. "I don't know," she said with flushing face. "I haven't learned how to tell scientifically, only this feels real, and this one doesn't." "Never mind the science," he said, smiling a little, and then he left her to herself. 3 days Maria's cold held sway. The mopping and the johnny cake proved to be not good for it. After that she went back to the store, and Grace, with a little softly sigh, put on her greasy apron, her work apron was always greasy, and took the dishcloth between her thumb and finger. Mr. Arthur, the senior partner, summoned Maria to the office. "Is your sister Grace, who has served us in your absence, a young lady of leisure?" "Not particularly," said Maria, smiling in spite of his dignity at the thought of poor Grace with her head in the oven, probably at that moment. "She is housekeeper for a family of 5. "Oh, at your own home?" "Yes, sir." Mr. Arthur leaned his chin on his lead pencil and mused. "Well, the fact is," he said at last, "if you and Miss Grace could change places, it would perhaps be agreeable to all parties. She gave very general satisfaction in the store, the customers liked her, and the clerks like her very much. She is low-voiced and gentle in her movements, and she tells real and imitation laces by instinct, or in some other mysterious way. At least, she rarely fails. In short, Miss Randolph, she has an aptitude for the business, which, I may as well say, and you will excuse my frankness, I am always frank, you have not. Now, Miss Randolph, we are prepared to engage your sister permanently, and give her the full salary, which is $1 a week more than you have been receiving, if that will suit you." "Engage her in my place, you mean?" "In your place." "Personally, Mr. Arthur, I am delighted with the proposition, and I think Grace will approve. I quite agree with you that I have no aptitude for the business. I hate lace. I always hated things that could be copied so precisely that you had to feel of them to tell the real from the false." Nevertheless, after making this emphatic address, Maria went home in a good deal of a maze. Once or twice she laughed outright. It was very funny, certainly. Grace able to earn her own living, and she, Maria, who had been useful and practical ever since she was born, not. "There are different ways of doing things, I suppose," she said aloud and quite humbly for her. And this little episode did Maria Randolph good. Also it did Grace good. There was a recognized place for her in the world then, even if it was only behind a lace counter. She felt more self-reliant. The wild, chaotic kind of living that had been in vogue in the Randolph family subsided, the dishes retired to their respective shelves, and comfort reigned once more. And people liked to buy laces at Arthur and McAllister's. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Storm and Moonshine. "What a horrid evening!" Mrs. Munroe said, with a shiver, and she drew a little black shawl closer about her shoulders. "It rains all the time nowadays." They were all in the little dining room, Mr. Randolph in his easy chair, in dressing gown and slippers, feebly trying to look over some accounts, stopping every few minutes to wipe his forehead and his thin hands, for the constant little cough produced a perspiration that was cold and clammy and disagreeable. In some way Mr. Randolph must have relief from that office. In some way he would soon have it. If no other channel opened, the restful grave would come to his aid. Maria felt this, and she chopped her meat for the morning hash, with her face all gathered in a frown. Life was hard to Maria, and she made it harder than she need. Why must she persist in carrying all her burdens for herself? Grace had drawn as near the light as she could, and held in her lap the only brightness that the room contained, some crimson worsteds. They kept a case of fancy articles in the store, and Grace made pretty trifles by instinct. She had made the happy discovery that she could help to replenish that case with great advantage to her own purse. In short, Grace was in a fair way to earn her own living, and it was only busy, practical Maria who was working hard and earning nothing. So she thought. But who will be kind enough to estimate how much those people really earn who spend their lives in skillfully contriving how to save the earnings of other people? Ermina, on the other side of the stand, was straining her eyes over black ruffles. There was no let-up to ruffles that she had to prepare for the next day's campaign. They were not always black ruffles, and the light was not always so dim as on this evening. All the gloom had concentrated itself. The Randolph expenses were being narrowed to a low scale. They had actually reached that pitiful point when an extra kerosene lamp, when they were all gathered in one room of an evening, was a luxury not to be thought of. So they sat close and strained their eyes over one. Helen was the only unoccupied person. She had affected to read the morning paper until she pronounced the light no better than a tallow candle. "I wonder you don't introduce one into your economy," she said scornfully to Maria, and that young lady answered, with a grave face, "Do you suppose it would be cheaper?" Helen vouchsafed no answer, and the silence that seemed to possess them all was renewed. Tom came suddenly in at the side door, letting in with him a gust of wind and rain, and leaving the door open a crack, as men are apt to do, while he rushed through to the kitchen with his dripping umbrella. Helen shivered and drew further into her shawl, and Maria pushed the door to with a bang. "You always leave doors open after you," she said a little fretfully, as Tom emerged from his wet overcoat and came back to the dining room. "I wanted to give you a taste of outside life, so that you would better appreciate the comforts of your position," he said cheerily, drawing a chair near his father. Helen sniffed. "Comforts!" she said sarcastically. "Why, yes, there is a marked difference between this room and the street. It rains in torrents, and it is the darkest night I ever saw. Well, I am ready for congratulations. I have found employment at last." Maria looked up from her hash with a gleam of satisfaction. Grace said, "Oh, good!" and Ermina asked with interest, "What is it?" "Before I tell that, I must remind you that I have been for more than 3 weeks now searching right and left for something to do, and the case was really growing desperate." Mr. Randolph dropped the paper on which he was figuring, and the pencil in his hand trembled as he said nervously, "You have not gone back to that saloon, have you, Thompson?" "No, sir," There was an emphatic ring in Tom's voice. "It is a respectable business this time. Only, Maria, if you board me, you will have to give me very prompt breakfasts. I'm to be on hand for the 7 o'clock car." "In the capacity of driver, I presume?" Mrs. Munroe said this for the utmost sarcasm, but Tom's answer was prompt. "That's it, exactly. How came you to guess so soon?" "Why, Tom Randolph!" Grace said, looking aghast. "Nonsense!" said Maria. "You'll believe anything, Grace. Do tell us, Tom, what you have to do with the 7 o'clock car?" "Drive the horses attached to it," Tom said, gravely. "Helen has guessed rightly. I am tired of idleness. Any work is better than that. And this is honest and decent." Up to this time Mrs. Munroe had not fully taken his meaning. The magnitude of his crime seemed too great for her mind to compass. She sat looking at him with absolute disgust in her face, and her voice was actually tremulous as she said, "Tom Randolph, I should think you had disgraced your father sufficiently. I don't know what he has done that he should be so utterly disappointed and disgraced in his son. I hope this will not break him down utterly." "Helen!" Mr. Randolph's voice had that peculiar ring in it that they as children had heard but a few times in their lives. "Helen, I am proud of him. I am glad when I see any one sufficiently independent to rise above foolish grades and distinctions. So far am I from being disgraced, I think I never was so sure of a successful future for my son as I am at this moment. Moral courage is something that I never had very much of, but it is something that I admire and respect." "There is no accounting for people's tastes," Helen said coldly, even haughtily. Then she took up her paper and professed to read. Someway no one liked to express an opinion after that, and the sewing and chopping went on quietly. Tom left them to look after kindlings for the morning fire. Ermina sewed to the end of her ruffle, and looked wearily over at the pile on the lounge, waiting to be sewed. Should she, or should she not, try to do more that evening? She was not obliged to sew in the evenings, but they were hurried. They always are hurried in dressmaking establishments. There never seems to come a time when the world is clothed. And it expedited matters so much in the next day's rush to have yards and yards of work turned down and basted. But Ermina was unusually tired this evening, body and heart. She pushed her chair back a little from the light, and shaded her weary eyes with her hand. Life looked unutterably dreary to her. The rain pelting unceasingly against the window, and the wind howling around the keyhole, served to deepen her sense of gloom. Through her fingers she could get peeps of her father's face, and she felt not exactly shocked at its pallor. The sight had grown too common to come as a shock, but it hurt her with a new pain. How feeble he looked, and how puzzled he seemed over the miserable figures. What a daily perplexity life must be to him, instead of having the rest and peace about it that a man of his years needed. The miserable lamp that smoked a little, as kerosene lamps frequently do, added to the general sense of discomfort and discouragement which possessed her. They were even too poor to have gaslight. They were growing poorer. She worked hard at her new business and carefully saved her earnings, yet there seemed to be less to live on than there used. There was less. Mr. Randolph's weakness and feebleness had grown upon him to such an extent that he had relinquished of necessity one duty after another, and, of course, his salary had grown proportionately smaller, and the family were coming to know that it really was only by courtesy that his place was kept at all. There was certainly enough to justify a feeling of apprehension as to the future, yet Ermina had of late been able to lift herself somewhat above it all, to trust her life and the lives of her kindred in the Father's hand. To-night, though, it was nearer despair than trust. She felt utterly cast down and forsaken, as if there were no brightness anywhere. Those ruffles over on the lounge waiting for her seemed like so many imps of darkness ready to sting her. She hated them, and the life stretching drearily out before her, filled with ruffles to hem and gather and plait, looked unutterably horrible. I want you to understand that I don't justify Ermina for being in this state of mind. Of course it was unreasonable and silly. It was no more right than it was for you to be cross all the morning because the steak was tough and the coffee cold when you came to breakfast. I have no doubt it was unchristian. So are 1/8 of the things that you have said and done today. But I insist that it was very human, and Ermina was an intensely human girl, with like passions and failings with yourself. Whether she hadn't a very little more to try her than you have had today, judge ye. The doorbell pealing through the house startled the family with the sudden sense of a something breaking rudely in on their quiet, which people feel when they have allowed themselves to sink into the depths of gloomy reverie. Helen dropped the paper with an exclamation. "Who on earth can be coming here in such a storm? It must be urgent business." Tom, who had been heard banging about the upper hall, now came down to answer the bell. They heard him show someone into the parlor. Then he came to the dining-room door and put his head in. "A messenger for you, Ermina." Then he vanished. "Someone about those dreadful dresses," Ermina said with a sigh. "They would come to look after their ruffles if it rained icicles." "Don't keep the poor victim long, whoever it is, or he will freeze." This was Maria's parting sentence. The dimmest of smoking lamps served to make the darkness of the little parlor visible. The stove had not even been set up yet. It was not late in the season, and people would not expect you to have a fire when there was no stove in which to make it. By dint of close looking, Ermina discovered a shadow in the dimness. It was tall and wore an overcoat. She went toward it with dignity, wondering at its errand. There was no mistaking the sudden light in her eyes as she neared it, and it spoke, though it said simply, "Good evening, Miss Ermina." She knew the voice, and there was pleasure mingling with the surprise with which she said, "Mr. Harper!" "Now you are wondering why I came out in the storm," he said, when they were comfortably seated. "I see the wonderment in your eyes, and I am not surprised at it. I confess to you that it doesn't look like a sane proceeding. But I had a reason, and it can be explained in a very few words. I wanted to see you." "That is remarkable," Ermina said with a little laugh. "I didn't know any one was ever in that state." "Did you not?" he said earnestly. "It is becoming a chronic state with me. I have been thinking about it nearly all this day, thinking about it and praying over it, and to-night I have braved the storm, resolved to tell you the whole story." A dozen times they wondered in the dining-room who could be keeping Ermina so. Then, as Tom did not appear again, they gave over wondering, and went their several ways. Helen had been asleep when Ermina, who shared her room, pushed open the door, and brought her dim little lamp into the darkness. She set it softly down and went to the window. The rain had ceased, and dozens of stars were twinkling. Helen popped up her head from among the pillows. "Where in the world have you been?" she asked in wonderment. "I've been nowhere," Ermina answered with shining eyes. "What a change there is in the weather! Do you know, Helen, the stars are shining, and it looks as though it would never rain again." "Who wanted you?" asked Helen, ignoring the stars. "And whoever it was, why didn't they spend the night?" "Why, it isn't but a few minutes." "A few minutes! It was nearly 10 o'clock when I came upstairs. It must be 11 now." "Oh, no," Ermina said quickly. "It couldn't be." "Well, who was it?" Thus pressed, Ermina's reluctant tongue succeeded in forming the words, "Mr. Harper." Helen echoed them. "Mr. Harper! What in the name of common sense did he want? Couldn't he have chosen a lovelier night for his errand?" "He is not afraid of the rain," Ermina said, evasively. "I should think not, nor of cold, nor of you, either. It is a wonder you did not freeze. His errand must have been very pressing. What did he want?" "I declare if there isn't the moon!" Ermina said, eagerly. "I didn't know it rose so late. I believe I had forgotten that there was one. Oh, how beautiful it is!" Mrs. Helen Munroe raised herself on one elbow, and spoke impatiently. "Ermina Randolph, I have asked you 3 times what Mr. Harper wanted. If you intend to tell me, I wish you would let the stars and the moon alone, and do so." Ermina dropped the curtain, and went over to the glass and began to take the pins out of her hair. Her cheeks were very glowing. "He wanted me," she said slowly, almost reverently. Mrs. Munroe sat up straight and looked at her. "You?" she repeated, intense amazement in her voice. "What do you mean?" "I mean that, with all that it implies. I do not wonder that you are astonished. You cannot be so much as I was. To think that God had that waiting for me, coming to me all the while. And only this very evening I felt that my life was desolate. I have been a very untrustful child, Helen. I wonder that he has had patience with me." Mrs. Munroe fixed the pillows under her head and lay down without another word. The lamp had been out for an hour, and Ermina had been turning herself over in the bed for nearly that length of time, when her sister made her first comment on the evening's revelation. "Well, I think he took a very rainy night for it." Chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. A New Start. Very soon thereafter there was another wedding in the Randolph family, utterly unlike the first one. So unlike, so ill-befitting in Helen's estimation the dignity of Ermina's coming position, that she went around for weeks beforehand with her forehead drawn in a row of wrinkles, and in kitchen and pantry held endless, hopeless discussions with Maria. As for Ermina, she did in many things just what people are not given to doing under the same circumstances. For instance, she kept her place in the sewing-room up to the very last week of her stay at home. Her reasons therefore were simple and conclusive. "I've nothing very special to do. I'm not going to have 16 flounced and plaited silk dresses. My wardrobe is to be simple, from taste partly, from necessity a great deal, and I need all the money I can earn." A morning wedding, no guests, no wedding cake. Over each of these 3 movements Helen exhausted herself and the patience of those around her with argument. "An evening wedding was so much more tasteful and stylish." "As to taste," Maria said, "that, of course, was a matter of taste, and tastes differed." "And as to style," Ermina chimed in, "I'm not stylish, you know, don't aim to be." "But Mr. Harper was," Helen said, "very stylish, and immensely wealthy. She thought some little regard ought to be paid to his position." The mention of Mr. Harper's name always produced a softened and quieted tone of voice in Ermina. So while Maria answered with unusual sharpness that "Mr. Harper's wealth was not supposed to pay the wedding expenses, and his position was strong enough to take care of itself," Ermina said gently that "Mr. Harper entirely approved of the arrangements. Indeed, they were of his own planning." "Well, I must say you are queer creatures," Helen said, with lifted eyebrows and vexed voice. "I don't know after all but you are well matched. One would suppose if people had any friends, they would like to see them about them on their wedding day. But, as Maria says, there is no accounting for people's tastes." There was a mixture of sharpness and humility in Ermina's answer. "I don't at this moment think of an individual in this town, outside of our own immediate family, that I care particularly ever to see again. It is a mortifying fact, and I don't doubt that it is my own fault, but it is a fact nevertheless. I'm sure I hope never to have to own it in regard to any other home of mine." "No danger," Maria said grimly. "Mr. Harper's millions would secure plenty of friends." Maria's was, however, a sort of satisfied grimness. She was very willing to have millions come into the family, especially when in their train they brought every other qualification. Her tussle with poverty had been too long, and her heart was too unselfish not to feel genuine joy that one of the family had emerged into the sunlight, especially when that one was Ermina, decidedly her favorite sister, and more especially when the sunshine was of Mr. Harper's own bringing. She thoroughly believed in Mr. Harper. "There are 2 ways of getting married," she said in a burst of confidence to Grace over their night toilet. "Helen married the handsome house, and the lace curtains, and the silver tea set, and the diamond ring, and plenty of silk dresses, and Horace Munroe thrown into the background as a kind of awkward necessity. Ermina, now, is going to marry Mr. Harper because the houses and the jewels come with him. I guess she is quietly glad whenever she happens to think of them, but it's Mr. Harper, anyhow. I recommend you to follow the latter example. It sounds more like the marriage service." "I'm not going to be married at all," said sleepy Grace. "I'm going to stay at home and keep house for father." Maria shrugged her shoulders. "My patience, I pity father," she said significantly, and the next instant was glad that Grace was too nearly asleep to feel the point of the sentence. Maria was nearly always sorry for her sharp points after she had made them. "But I don't see why you can't have a little cake like decent people," said Helen, returning freshly to the charge after a night's rest. "Who ever heard of a wedding without any wedding cake?" "What is the use of it?" Ermina asked briskly. "If it were to be an evening entertainment, I suppose we should have it. But who wants to munch cake at 8 o'clock in the morning? I'm sure I would rather have a potato." "Such an unearthly hour," murmured Helen, in increasing disgust, and Ermina innocently reminded her that it was an hour later than usual. There was little use in discussions. Both Mr. Harper and Ermina seemed to be hopelessly set in their determination to ruffle the family life as little as possible. One little sentence escaped Ermina in conversation with Grace, with whom each sister was more apt to be confidential than with each other. "I would have liked to have a little more of a commotion, of course. Who wouldn't? It is not in human nature not to want to make a nice time when one is married. But we had such a dreadful time in getting over the expenses of Helen's wedding that I am determined to bring no more debts of that kind. I would rather have baked potatoes and salt for the wedding breakfast than to have father harassed with bills." Tom was dressing for the wedding, though Helen disdainfully said she saw no use in dressing. They might as well wear their calico wrappers. But they didn't. Instead they put on their best dresses, and the table looked fresh and pretty, with no cake but doughnuts, but delicious coffee to drink with them. Tom needed assistance in the matter of a button, and was glad to find Maria at liberty for a minute to sew it on. During the operation he laughed outright at his own thoughts, and then proceeded to explain. "One of my brother drivers came to me last night for a confidential chat. I wish you could have seen his puzzled and important face. He is that Jerry that you think is so good-natured. What do you think he wanted?" "I'm sure I don't know. This button has split in 2, Tom." "Well, here's another. I couldn't imagine what he was coming at. He called me aside and looked so important. He begged my pardon for troubling me they are all remarkably polite to me and he said that 4 or 5 of them had been having a time with their washerwoman because she didn't use starch enough. They're wonderfully particular fellows on Sunday. She ironed in wrinkles, too, he said, and then, after considerable stammering, he managed to get out that a number of them had been talking over the immaculateness of my linen, and had decided to get me to negotiate with my washerwoman, whoever she was, to see if she would do their work. The poor fellow was utterly crestfallen when I told him that my laundress was my sister." "They are letting that coffee boil over, I smell it," was Maria's lucid reply. "I knew something would happen if I came away. Is that all you want, Tom?" "All right, much obliged," and Maria went back to the breakfast. "A rich brother-in-law is a very fine thing to have, but you can't eat him, nor make clothes out of him, so the summing up of the whole matter is, that I must find something to do that will help support the family, And, Helen, you will have to keep house and do the cooking." Of course it was Maria who said this. "I'm sure I'm willing," Helen said drearily, "only I can't imagine what you will do." "I'll do something," Maria said, determination in her face and voice. Something besides a wedding had come to the family. Only the day after Ermina left them, Mr. Randolph, going to his office as usual, looking not paler nor more feeble than usual, so far as they could see, came from there an hour afterward in the carriage of his employer, was supported on the arm of a brother clerk to his room, he had fainted at his post. "Nothing serious, I trust," the young man said, reassuringly, and the daughters hoped it wasn't, and told each other that he had been unusually fatigued and excited during the preparation for Ermina's departure. He needed rest. Tomorrow he would be better. But tomorrow came, and after a good many tomorrows had passed, they began gradually to realize that he would not go to the old seat in the counting room again. So there was Grace's salary in the store and Tom's wages as a streetcar driver to support the family. No wonder that even Helen awakened to the necessity of doing something. But what was it to be? Several days were spent in fruitless search, and it was after one of those days, when Mr. Randolph's cough had been more distressing than usual, that Maria, in a mood halfway between apathy and despair, washed the dishes by the light of a smoking kerosene lamp. It needed a new burner, but they were too poor to afford one. She was alone in the kitchen. Grace had returned to the store, and Helen was resting on the lounge in the sitting room after the wearying duties of the day, for Maria had been out all the afternoon engaged in her unsuccessful search for employment, and Helen had done the kitchen work with what patience and skill she could command for the occasion. Tom, in the woodshed, was whistling softly, and the tune he whistled suggested familiar words, "Thus far the Lord hath led me on, thus far his power prolongs my days, and every evening shall make known some fresh memorial of his grace." Presently the whistling broke into actual words, and he sang, "Much of my time has run to waste." Then he pushed open the kitchen door, with his arms full of kindlings. "There is no truer line than that," he stopped his singing to say to Maria. "And yet, isn't it a queer world? I'm actually trying now, with all my might, to redeem the time. My work is honest, and I'm trying to be faithful, and I overheard Judge Morris tell his son Charlie, who used to be my chum, you know, that he was afraid I had gone to the dogs, that I was actually a streetcar driver." "The rest of my time is likely to run to waste," Maria said, dwelling moodily on the line quoted. Then she roused herself to respond to his remark. "I shouldn't care what Judge Morris thought, or his son Charlie either. I presume they considered you all right while you were a gentleman of leisure. Tom, how came you ever to decide to take that work to do?" "Well," said Tom, speaking reflectively, and depositing his kindlings in the box as he spoke, "indirectly, Peter Armstrong had as much to do with it as any one. You don't know, perhaps, what a queer fashion he has of reading the Bible? He discovered that there was a Peter in it, and he 'hunted him up,' as he says, and read about him. Sometimes lives a week on an idea of Peter Bibles. Sometimes it is a month before he takes up a new item. I have been immensely interested in his system. Now you know it is only a little while since I started out on a new plan of living, and something suggested to my mind the determination to be a whatsoever Christian." "A what?" said puzzled Maria. "A whatsoever Christian. I'm afraid I should have shrunken from it if I had comprehended in what ways it would lead me. I have been amazed a good many times already. Well, one morning the verse proved to be, 'Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might.' It was after I had spent some weeks in looking for work, and that very morning I had not been away from the house 10 minutes, when I heard, in a curious sort of way, that they were having trouble with the car drivers, dismissed several. Whatsoever my hand findeth, said I to myself. My patience, said I. Why, I didn't think it would set me to driving car-horses. But it was the only whatsoever that appeared to me that day, and by night I had decided it. I have not been sorry, said Tom, taking off his hat and brushing the thick hair from his forehead. In fact, I think I can say I am glad, though the position has not been a particularly pleasant one. It's a queer idea, Maria said, with a short little laugh. But I think there is a good deal more energy than religion about it. I like that sort of motto. Adopt it, said Tom eagerly. I wish you would. I think you would like it. And I'm sure I would like the way in which it would lead me. I wouldn't be afraid of that, Maria said loftily. I'm no shirk. I wouldn't be a bit afraid to live out all the whatsoevers in the world. Then try it, Tom said with increasing earnestness. Will you? I haven't the least doubt of your ultimate success if you will undertake it. Come, will you pledge yourself? Why, I presume I've always done it. I know I've done with my might whatsoever I had to do. That isn't the first one, Tom said significantly. Then he went back to get more kindlings. When the dishes were done and the kitchen in order, Maria went to the window and looked out into the moonlight, folding her arms on the window-seat and staring out without seeing moonlight or stars or anything else but her own thoughts. Tom, she said suddenly, as that person came in again, this time with a pail of water, have those men, Jerry and those others you told me of, found a washerwoman to their mind yet? No, said Tom, laughing. Isn't it queer that they should be so particular? They keep in a continual growl. That Jerry is engaged to be married, they say, and I presume that is why he wants much shining linen. Mine shines beautifully, they say. Well, Tom, I'm going to put your whatsoever straight into practice. You tell them, tomorrow morning, that I will do their washing for them. This is Friday evening. I'll begin next week, and you can keep on the lookout for some more people who want washing done. Tom set his pail down so heedlessly that the water splashed over himself and the floor. You can't mean it, he said, regarding her with an incredulous stare. Yes, I can. I'll show you if I don't. I can buy soap and starch, and we are obliged to keep fire, and washing clothes at 75 cents a dozen isn't unprofitable business. Besides, I can't find anything else to do. If it isn't a whatsoever, I don't know what you would call it. Well, said Tom, after regarding her speechlessly for a few minutes, I don't know but it is. It is one that requires rather more moral courage than car driving, I believe, and it only goes to prove to me that if you should take up that motto, you would carry it out with power. But, Maria, I tell you, you have skipped several. I wish you would begin at the beginning. Well, I will, said Maria energetically. I'm not afraid of it. I've always believed that genuine religion, that which accomplishes the work in this world, was just going with energy what was set before one to do. I'm willing to try it. I haven't the least idea what they say, but I'm not afraid of them. Shall I take them as they come? That is the way I am doing, said Tom with shining eyes. Very well. You say you are a whatsoever Christian. I'll be a whatsoever woman, and we'll see how far apart we'll keep. I'll look up the first one as soon as I have time. End of chapter 28. End of Household Puzzles by Pansy. Recording by Trisha G. Thank you for reading with me.